to use. And that tool is dua. Like, you know, when we used to go out and do street dawah in Houston. And I remember we would take a bunch of brothers, we'd go out and, you know, speak to people and things like that. And I actually remember the first time I went, there's a place in Houston, and again, this is maybe 15 years ago, it's called Monteros, right? So this place, Monteros, what I didn't know at the time is that is where all of the homosexuals hang out. And my dawah partner, Khalil, he basically took me straight there, right? Now let me remind you of the context. This is 15 years ago, so not like today where we've almost become acclimated to the idea. So then it was like shocking, you know, and I remember he came up and he was like, okay, you know, you're going to make da'wah to this person, and you know, he's like, well, I'm homosexual. I told Khalil, I'm like, yo, that's all you, man. I'm not dealing with that, right? But going out, I always used to encourage the brothers that before you go out and before you start speaking to people, make a dua to Allah that Allah would guide someone at your hands. Because guidance is not in your hands. It's not your argument. It's not, you know, all of these epistemic tools or other rational tools, whatever tools we're giving, these are just tools. At the end of the day, the one who's going to guide that person is Allah, right? And sometimes what happens is that if you want guidance for someone, yes, you've got the tools, but maybe you're missing tahajjud. Maybe you don't want it bad enough for that person, right? I hear people all the time, yeah, you know, I was speaking to my coworker, you know, and you know, I really, you know, he's not getting convinced. And I would ask the person, I said, when did you make dua for him? And they're taking a step back, like, oh, well, I didn't think about that. Okay, well, let's start with that, man. If you really want guidance, you really want this person to not enter the fire of hell, right? Which is what you should want. How much dua have you made for him? Have you gotten up in the last third of the night and begged Allah to guide this person, right? So those type of things, just as a reminder, yes, we get into a lot of nuances about the arguments and things like that, but don't lose sight. Keep your eye on the ball, right? And don't get on a train to Never Never Land where it's just about you and winning the argument, right? So I know I sound like a broken record, but I think it's really important that we understand that very clearly, right? Because you get sucked in, and it happens no matter, you know, conversations, that's just the nature of how it is. And that's the nature of shaitan as well. He wants you to get into jidal, right? Argumentation without any sort of benefit. Okay? So just as a reminder, just to keep that in mind, inshallah, before we start today. Well, you know what? I'm not going to do that yet. So let me just get to where we were, inshallah, and continue from there. So I'm going to escape here for a second and just scroll down. Oops, that's not what I wanted. We had that. All right. So we had spoken about science. We had spoken about, is God merciful? I'm actually going to move forward because of time, inshallah. So, my apologies about this. Just want to... Okay. So I'm going to put it up to you guys. We can do... inshallah, we're going to cover both subjects, but I'll tell you the order, and I'll let you guys... We'll have a democratic vote. Okay? The two topics, inshallah, that we're going to cover, and hopefully a third, the two topics that I'd like to definitely cover is, number one, the Qur'an's argument for the existence of Allah. That's number one. Number two is how to show that the Qur'an is from Allah without reference to the Arabic language. So which one would you guys like to do first? So who wants to do the Qur'an's argument? Okay, got a few people here. Who wants to do how to show the Qur'an is from Allah without? You voted twice, man. What's going on? You didn't? You did it once? Okay, all right. Maybe my eyes were deceiving me. All right, so go ahead once again. So I think most of us want to do the Qur'an. Okay, so now let me jump down to those slides, and then we'll go from there, inshallah, and we'll come back to this. And by the way, this course is quite long, as you can tell. So let me see here. Actually, you know what? We may have to do the Qur'an's argument and then do the because the slides aren't in this deck. So The decision's been made for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with this, and then I'll have to look up the slides from the other topic, inshallah. So, democracy works, but not always. Okay. So, in this particular section, we're going to be looking at the Quranic argument for God's existence, all right? Now, this particular argument, the thing is that when we look at how arguments are structured within the Quran, what you'll notice is that you will not find structures which we call in the format of discursive reasoning, all right? In the sense that as human beings, we reason in a certain kind of systematic format, right? So we talk about deductive reasoning, right? You have two premises and a conclusion. So that sort of format is not found in the Quran, right? And the reason being is because, remember, right, Allah knows us better than we know ourselves. And so it's not only rationality, but He's also targeting your fitrah, as we had mentioned, okay? Now, when it comes to the rational arguments as they are presented in the Quran, what happens is that we look at them and then we try to put them in a format such that we can use it in a discursive reasoning format. But we want to be careful with that to say, why did Allah put it in the format that He put it in? So the ayah we're going to be speaking about, bi'idhnillah, is actually in the format of a question. And the question here, because the nature of questions and how questions are put forth, is to get the person to think about things and to think about the options, right? So the ayah in and of itself is very straightforward. So you don't need any sort of deep explanation or anything like that. But you can always, and I was talking to someone yesterday about the Quran being multi-layered and multi-leveled, okay? And it is valid for someone that, let's say, is having doubts about the existence of Allah, but they don't, they haven't delved deeply into intricacies and nuances of philosophy. They're just kind of, I'm just doubting this, right? It's for that person. At the same time, it is also for the person that wants to or is engaged with thinking deeper, able to deal with that as well, okay? So that's the first thing when it comes to this particular ayah. All right. So we'll start with a little bit of a thought experiment, okay? Imagine that you enter into a room and or you find yourself, you black out. We always have these blackout experiments, right? You black out and you wake up in a room, okay? This room has no doors, no windows, no way out, no way in, okay? The only thing in this room is this desk that you're seeing and the laptop. And on this laptop, it says this laptop and desk came from nothing. How plausible do you think that is? Do you think like, okay, yeah, that makes total sense? Yeah? It makes total sense? No, it makes no sense. I know it's early, right? It makes no sense. All right, so it doesn't matter what the laptop says or what's there. Point being is that because our first area is going to be talking about nothing, we want to clarify what we mean by nothing. So nothing means no thing, the absence of something. Even though there are very, you can say, sophisticated, philosophers that try to argue that it is possible to get something from nothing, but their definition of nothing is actually something. Okay. Now I know it sounds ridiculous. Okay, and it's just like, why are we just? And it's almost like it's just a syntactic. We're doing syntactic gymnastics. But to be very clear, what we mean by nothing is the absence of something. Okay. So when you have quantum fields and you say, "Oh, that's nothing," no, those are quantum fields. If you have quarks, those are quarks. That is not nothing. Okay. All right. Now, what is the ayah? So the ayah is in chapter 52, verse 35 and 36. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Okay, were they created by nothing? Or were they the creators of themselves? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? Rather, they are not certain. Okay? Just as a reminder, I have on there, these verses function as a means to awaken the innate disposition. In other words, to uncloud the fitrah, right? That is their first function, right? However, they also provide the logical basis of a universal and powerful argument for the existence of God. And by the way, just on a side note, there was a person in my family, and he was kind of notoriously known to push people's buttons, okay, to just annoy people. And he would do that because he would always kind of drop some sort of strange doubt in the middle of a conversation and then just walk away. I don't know if you know people like this, right? Like people are talking about whatever, the weather and politics or whatever, and he just comes out like, how do you know God exists? And people are like, well, the thing is, and he just walks away. And you're like, wait a minute, why are we talking about this, right? So he would do that and just walk away. So a lot of times, the family members like, does he even believe in God, So I sat him down once, and I'm like, so tell me, what's the deal? And he says, you know what? Like in my entire life, I've dealt with religious people, and I'm not impressed. Like, I don't see what Islam has done for people, right? So therefore, I actually don't believe in God. Okay. We actually sat down and went through this ayah, and by the time we were done, he goes, no one's ever said that to me, right? And he said that actually makes complete sense, and it makes sense. Like Allah exists, that's true, And so, anyways, now it wasn't that simple, by the way. I know I'm just saying it within 3 seconds. But there was a kind of a process there. Okay, now let's start with the first part, right? Were they created from nothing? خُلِقُوا. Now, again, although the ayah refers to specifically to human beings, it can also be applied to anything that began to exist. All right, so خُلِقُوا, for those who are studying Arabic, is not خَلَقَ. خُلِقُوا means that they were created, made, or originated. Okay, so while in this particular context, it is referring to the human being, but it can be expanded to everything, right? All right. Now, we have to ask the question, did the universe begin to exist? All right? Someone may say, look, we don't really need to entertain the question because the universe has always been around. So when Allah says, were they created from nothing, right? Did the universe come from nothing? The universe doesn't need to come from anything because it's always been here. All right? So how do we respond to that? Anyone want to take a crack? We kind of mentioned it in the dependency argument yesterday. Okay, where's our mic person? Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay.
So if the universe were to have existed eternally, then it wouldn't be possible for us to exist, right? Because if there was no beginning, then there would be no series of events which would lead to our time right now in existence.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay. How about, can you give us a practical, some sort of understanding how, because I get what you're saying, right? And most of us, because we've covered the example, get what you're saying. But how would you articulate that to someone that's maybe like, well, what do you mean? So what's the answer to, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
By way of an example. And you can't use my chai example.
Can I use your domino example?
The domino. Okay, you can use the domino example.
Yeah, definitely. So for the dominoes to tip, there has to be an initial cause for that. So the first one has to get tipped. And you can't just keep going back and back until there's literally no cause left. There has to be an initial cause,
sure,
an uncaused cause, right? And then also, there's scientific evidence for all matter splitting.
Don't worry about that, man. We're not
okay.
Don't worry about the scientific evidence. We just we covered science yesterday, right? So don't worry about the scientific stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, something that seems when I heard this was very simple to me is that if it took an infinite amount of time for us to come into existence, then we could not have existed.
Right.
It's very
a good way of putting
simple.
It. Sure. Okay, good. So the first contention is that, look, why would Allah mention anything about being created from nothing? Because the universe has always been around. But again, like we said, if that's the issue, or if we make a claim that the universe has always been around, then we're stuck with the problem of the infinite regress of historical events. Meaning, we would not exist. Like from yesterday, if you remember the chai example that I had, I would never get to drink a cup of chai, right? That chai that I wanted, I would never get it, okay? Everyone remembers that example from yesterday, right? Yeah, we're good on that? Okay, so therefore, finite things had a beginning. You have to understand that right off the bat. Okay, number two, actual infinite doesn't exist. Because someone may say, okay, the universe began from, it has always existed, it's infinite. A second kind of response to that would be like, look, You can have a mathematical infinite, right, theoretically, but an actual infinite, it doesn't exist. What I mean by that, so if we imagine that, let me just give an example. If we imagine that we had a bag of infinite number of balls, okay, would such a bag be possible in the sense that you have a limited bag that is actually extant and it actually exists? Or would you say, like, okay, this number of balls you're going to keep on filling into this bag that is infinite, like how would you actually give an example of the infinite in the physical world is what we're looking at, okay? Because there is no example within the physical world of the infinite, all right? So anyone want to challenge that? Yeah. Okay, but that's exactly what we're arguing, is that the whole concept is that the universe is not infinite, right? So we're saying that it has a finite existence. There's nothing in our observable world that you can say, like, look, that thing, that is infinite. There's a mathematical infinite, right? And we can use that to do many things, but there's no actual physical example of the infinite. Yeah. So I think time is a very interesting topic, right? Yeah, so then you have to ask the question, is time physical or is that a metaphysical concept in and of itself, right? And then even time, I don't know if I want to open this bag of worms, but doesn't time necessarily need to have something that it's related to, be related to something in order for you to measure it, to say that yes, time is there, right? Meaning you can't, like time as an abstract concept, it's fine, we can talk about time, but like understanding time means, for instance, you understand days and nights, which is contingent upon understanding the earth and the sun, and they have a relationship. Therefore, you can understand time, right, which is known as serial time. Our understanding of time is contingent, right? Time itself, that's a separate concept altogether, right? But I'm saying in a physical understanding of time, you could argue that is a metaphysical concept that is dependent upon interlocking concepts that have to do with physical entities, right? Does that make sense? In terms of, okay, what else? What other? Is it too early for me to be like pushing you guys? Okay. And there's other thought experiments you can do in this area. So stacking an infinite number of cubes. You would never be able to stack an infinite number of cubes and have a definite stack of cubes, right? If you're stacking them forever, okay? So there's no example within the physical world of an infinite. So in the physical world, it doesn't exist. Yeah. Yeah, go for it. A road? Which road is this? Oh, okay. Hypothetical. Okay.
6 meters per second. Can you repeat the question, please? And then you're driving at 3 meters per second. There's no question because because the sisters can need to hear you. Okay. So the question that the Sheikh had was, can there be a physical example of an infinite thing, right? So if you assume there's a road that grows at 6 meters per second and you're driving at 2 meters per second, the road will exist in the physical world ad infinitum, and you will never reach its end. Therefore, theoretically speaking, there is a physical example of infinite.
So
and again, like I started, just for the sake of argument.
No, that's good. That's good. Because it's good to think through these things. So what I would ask then is that necessarily a physical infinite or is that a mathematical infinite? Because we have a hypothetical road, right, which are applying a certain mathematical concept to it, right? So yes, in our perception of this hypothetical, the road is physical. The concept of justifying infinite, however, what you use is mathematical, right? So I'm saying that yes, mathematical infinite does exist, right? And we use that all the time in such an example. But in the physical world, you can't give a physical example and say, look, this thing, it's infinite, right? So I think that's where you would have that's where you'd be able to kind of see that there's a difference between mathematical infinite and a physical infinite. But it's good point, mashallah. Jazakullahu Khair. Okay, let's move on. So remember, this actually goes back to the dependency argument, right? Things with limited physical quantities do not give rise to their own limitations. We spoke about this when we spoke about the argument from contingency and the argument from dependency. So I'm not going to get in and repeat this because I think you guys, we squeezed your brains down to the core and down to the limit, okay? So let's now come to the ayah itself and let's look at the flow of the ayah, okay? How does it go? So it starts off, let me come back to that, inshallah. Yeah. So the logic of the ayah itself, all right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Am khuliqu min ghayri shay. Were they created from nothing, all right? Or are they the creators of themselves? Did they create themselves? Were they self-created? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? In other words, were they created from something else that was created? Rather, they are not certain, okay? And there we've got if all three of these, the answer to that is no, then by logical necessity, they have to come from something that is uncreated, okay? And so this forms a type of, as we said, a deductive form of an argument. Now again, this is not how the Quran formulates it. This is for us to understand it and articulate it, all right? So let's start from nothing, all right? Were we created from nothing? So what do we mean by nothing? By nothing, when we're defining it, we understand that there's no prior causal conditions, okay? So remember, yesterday we said that it's self-evidently true about cause and effect. What nothing refers to is that there is no prior causal conditions, okay? Nothing also refers to the absence of anything. And anything means like there's nothing, right? So again, quantum fields, all these things. Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing, he eventually ends up saying that it's something. He just wants to call that something nothing, all right? So anyway, it has no potential and it's no thing. It's kind of ridiculous that we're actually getting into details about explaining what is nothing, but on a simple basis, nothing is nothing. It's the absence of something, okay? So can the universe, all of this finite physical reality, come from nothing, right? No prior causal condition. It just pops into existence from a very simple way. Is that possible? Yes. You can. Where's the mic? Inshallah. Hisham, give me water.
So whenever they say the universe came from nothing,
Yeah.
they're just playing with definitions then?
Yeah, I mean, you have to then ask them to explain what do you mean by nothing,
Oh, okay.
right? If it's, I think you can have the universe come from nothing. Okay, fine, that's fine. Jazakallahu Khair. That's fine as an assertion. You can assert that, but how, like conceptually, there's no way to substantiate that. Like, it came from nothing, but what does that even mean? And eventually, if you boil it down, no matter how technical you get, right? For those of you who love science, quantum fields and all those things, I mean, you're still relying on something, right? Something that has some sort of prior causal condition. What we're saying is there's no prior causal condition to, what has come about. That's what we mean by nothing. If there's a prior causal condition, right, then that thing that you're referring to is not nothing. Does that make sense? Okay. You want to hand the mic back, inshallah.
I would say that if we are saying that something is coming from nothing, it means it is ever existed. Then it means it's a creator, not being created.
Okay, yeah. So I think you're jumping to the conclusion, but yeah, that's where we're eventually going to get to, inshallah. Okay, so can a universe come from nothing? Well, from nothing, nothing comes, all right? All right, so mathematically, 0 plus 0 plus 0 is equal to 0. And at the end of the day, the logical implications and equivalence are just absurd, right? No one practically thinks that they can get something from nothing, okay? You know, and things don't just pop into being, right? You're not in court and, you know, in front of the judge, and the judge is like, well, why were you speeding? Well, this leprechaun just popped into existence and put my foot on the gas, and so it's not me, right? So it's just no one uses that as in any sort of real sense, okay? So the first option, can the universe and everything come from nothing? It's a no, okay? What's the second well, okay, here are the main objections. Does causality make sense outside of the universe? All right, here what we're talking about, they're saying, okay, the only reason that you're saying that, you know, something can't come from nothing is because those are the rules in the universe. You're saying there's no physical example, but outside the universe, maybe there's some sort of place or area or reality where something can come from nothing. Causality only makes sense in the universe. All right, how would you respond to that? What do you think? Where's the mic? Okay, go for it.
You would say that the burden of proof is on them to prove that?
Okay, that's a good point, right? Going back to self-evident truths, yeah.
In that sense, they basically disprove themselves because, like, they're the ones that said that there's no cause, but then they immediately retract the statement saying that, oh, there is actually a cause. It's outside of the universe in a world, a magical fantasy place where the laws of our world don't apply. So, like, no matter how they twist it, they still come back to the point that, okay, there is a cause.
Okay. So I think what the contention here is that does the very concept of causality make sense outside the universe? So it's a bit different, right? They're not saying that, yes, there is a cause, and I've capitulated on that. What they're saying is this whole concept of cause and effect, that outside the universe, that might not apply, right? And so, therefore, there is a possibility that you could get something from nothing, right? So just to kind of go ahead and so move forward, what is the logical link between these things? That's what the issue is, okay? So even if there was, let's say hypothetically, right, this area where causality doesn't exist, fair enough, but then what does that have to do with something coming from nothing, right? You're still left with a problem. Does that make sense? Does the contention make sense versus the response? Yes. Let me get you the mic.
So if they're saying that something came from nothing in a different universe, and that only happened once, why wouldn't continuously happen in this universe?
Sure.
Why,
I mean, you could argue that.
Once.
Right. Yeah, you could argue that.
Yeah.
Right. But again, what they're saying is the only reason you can say you as a Muslim or whatever, you can justify causality is because it makes sense in the universe that you exist in, right? But perhaps there's a universe where that rule doesn't exist, right? I mean, the problem with hypotheticals is that when they start pushing you for like proving the existence of God, but yet they then kind of rely on something where there's no sort of evidence whatsoever. Like you can hypothetically make all sorts of things, right? And they do, right? Like what if there was a multiverse? Okay, but is there evidence of a multiverse? Like, okay, what if there's so many what ifs, right? The issue is that, remember, I always said that kufr will always contradict itself. You will always find inconsistencies in how they're able to express something. So it's a matter of finding those inconsistencies, even when the contentions are pushed to say, okay, well, does causality make sense outside the universe? Be like, okay, well, what does that have to do with the universe coming from nothing, right? Like it's still, how does that undermine the argument, right? What's the logical connection?
The other thing I would argue is these guys, they only believe in the seen, a reaction.
Okay. Sure.
Why are you talking about the unseen? You haven't seen that.
Right.
Why are you talking about that?
Perhaps, yeah, that might be. But you know, when people want to argue, they're not gonna go back to like, again, inconsistency, right? Yeah.
So I'd like to share a brief anecdote. But basically, I think a few years ago, I'd spoken to a cosmologist from the University of Chicago, who's actually a researcher at Argonne National Laboratories, and his PhD was actually in subatomic field theory. So he has very strong grounding in, you know, of course, the origins of the universe and whatnot. And I had sort of brought up this sort of, and I wasn't as sort of educated as I am sort of now, but as a sort of cause and effect argument to him, because I think from the way I had spoken to him, I could sense that he had sort of a more naturalist paradigm. And this is actually something that he said. when I said, when I sort of brought up this point that everything that begins to exist has a cause, therefore, and the universe began to exist, therefore it has a cause. He said that actually, with the very beginning of time, conditions were so extreme, like in terms of temperature and heat, and sort of the environment was so absurd and beyond our like even comprehension that our understanding of cause and effect may not have even been sort of plausible. Sure. So then in that sense, he said that, we actually don't know if cause and effect even would have existed at that time period. Sure. So then I was sort of confused on how to sort of respond in that sense.
Yeah, because then it moves from empirical analysis to belief, right? Because there was so much so that we could not have, okay, but that's an assertion. I mean, if you're going to stick with your philosophical naturalism that we can only have explanations by way of physical phenomena, okay, then you've broken your own rule, right? So either everything can be explained by way of physical phenomena or everything cannot, right? If it can't, then you have to at least concede that that is not, that is not part of, let's say, empirical analysis. That is a part of belief. Like, that is an assumption and an assertion. That's it.
But another point that you mentioned was he also said that he doesn't think that absolute truth exists within the natural world, but the only means to attaining absolute truth is through logic and mathematics. Is that a correct statement?
I mean, that is a means, but that's not the only way. And then what do you mean by absolute truth?
Like, for something to
What
be...
does he mean by absolute truth, rather?
Like in the example you're giving about connecting drawing a conclusion from multiple premises,
Yeah.
that's something that is undeniably true. Like for a
Sure.
person to reject that would be sort of nonsensical, right?
Sure.
But that's a logical argument.
Yeah.
There's no rationality to that. There's no something, you're not deriving like
Right.
the bachelor one you gave.
Yeah.
There's no like physical phenomenon that it deals with. There's no sort of
Sure,
argument from
so even I would push him on that and say, well, why is that necessarily true? Because remember, you have to have first principles. Okay? Now, to push him and say like, okay, so what are the first principles you're relying upon? Now, that's one that you've stated that that's the only way to truth, let's say mathematical and logic, but why is that the only way to truth? Right? And how do you then justify or let's say understand your first principles, right? So I agree, but then if someone were to say, okay, I disagree with logic itself, then where do you go with that? Like, how do you deal with that from his paradigm?
But how would you connect logic to the natural world? That's what I want to understand. Like, how could you say things are definitely true in the natural world? Like in the
How
same
are
way
things definitely true in the natural world?
absolutely true in the same way that you can do for logical sort of conclusions.
So again, what I would say is you have to connect his first principles, right? So if you were to ask me, like, how do you connect them? Well, that's pretty simple. You've got your fitrah, right? And your fitrah recognizes the natural world. So for us, that paradigm is very clear and consistent. The problem is that to be consistent in a worldview relying upon philosophical naturalism, you then have to either capitulate on the initial claim that we can only explain things by way of physical phenomena, or then you have to at least entertain the idea that your first principles, you can't have that as a stopping point. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Things that can come from nothing, quantum vacuum, I spoke about that. Quantum vacuum is something, right? There's a prior causal connection there, there's a prior cause there, right? So prior causal condition. All right. Does causality make sense outside of time? We addressed that when you asked about time, right? So you kind of foreshadowed that. And Lorentz crosses nothing is in fact something, because even when he digs down and says, okay, so there's a possibility, let's say, by way of quantum mechanics and so on and so forth, that by way of quarks, things can come about. Problem is quarks and fields and things like that, that is still something. Remember, nothing is the absence of something, right? There's no causal conditions that allow something to come about. That's what we mean by nothing, okay? So that being the case, that is a causal condition, which means that it is a something, all right? So that's not nothing. Does that make sense? I know that's almost, yeah. Does causality make sense outside the universe? Okay, so what I had mentioned is that so an easy way to understand that, we initially, were you here when we spoke about naturalism? You were, okay. Does causality make sense out of the universe? The easy way of responding to that is say, but doesn't that run antagonist to your own perception of how you explain things, right? Because you can only, according to you, only explain things by way of natural phenomena, and you're limited to that. Now you're saying, that there's a possibility that causality may not make sense outside the universe, but now you have capitulated to say there are things outside the universe that are not according to naturalistic processes, right? So take your pick. Either you say there's no metaphysical concepts outside the universe, right? And then we can have a conversation. Or everything is physical and can only be described by way of physical processes, in which case, what you're saying, does causality make sense outside the universe? You can't, under your own perception and paradigm, justify that. So you have to kind of say, you got to pick one or the other, right? Does that make sense to everyone? Yes? Okay, good, inshallah. Okay, so a conflation between the theological nothing, meaning no material stuff, and the philosophical nothing, right? No prior causal conditions. Someone would say, isn't God something? Right? Like, well, so clearly God creates out of nothing. So then therefore, how can you say that things, there's a possibility according to your worldview? So again, there's a conflation between the theological nothing, meaning no material stuff, and the philosophical nothing, no prior causal conditions. These are two separate things, okay? When we say that Allah creates out of nothing, we're saying that there's no material things, okay? But Allah still has a will. There's still, from that perspective, that is still something, okay? There's the will of Allah, right? There is the actions of Allah and so on and so forth. Those are still things. When we say nothing, we're saying that we're defining nothing as no prior causal conditions, okay? But Allah does cause things by His will and so on and so forth, okay? So does everyone understand why this becomes, yeah. Let's get the mic.
In that case, when you bring up the argument, couldn't an atheist just basically point fingers back at you and say like, oh, well, you just defined nothing as no parallel causal conditions and the absence of anything. But then now you're saying nothing is something, it is divine will and divine power. So how do you respond to an argument like that? So
that's what we're saying, is that they're conflating they're conflating the theological nothing, right? In terms of what we're saying. So we're saying that when we say that Allah creates out of nothing, that there's no material matter, right? There's nothing material, and Allah basically kun fayakun, and He creates something, right? Mm-hmm. But the philosophical nothing is meaning that there's no cause, like there's no cause whatsoever. There's no causal conditions to have something come about, right? So if you remember my example of things popping into existence, that's in essence what we're saying, is that without any sort of causal condition, that's what we mean by nothing. And that's like, how do you substantiate that, right? That doesn't negate the idea that Allah can create out of nothing, right? There's two separate things here. One is physical stuff, like Allah has created physical things out of nothing, right? But that nothing is actually something. In other words, it is His will, okay? Nothing from a philosophical point of view is that there's no causal conditions whatsoever. It's just there's an absence of something. There's an absence of conditions. There's an absence of everything. Make sense? I don't know. I know it gets a bit this thing. Okay.
Won't that sort of reasoning open the door of like more definitions of nothing? Like, I don't know, but like from my perspective, like going down this rabbit hole can open the door for like accepting Lawrence Krauss's ridiculous definition of what nothing is.
Okay. Why? How so?
Because an atheist could argue that, okay, so you have two separate definitions of nothing. Why not add a third definition?
Sure. So according to your worldview, right, so we're saying, according to your worldview, you're saying, or let's agree, right, that nothing is the absence of prior causal conditions, okay? According to you, right, according to your rules. Now, if you want to take my rules, where God exists, then we can entertain the causal condition being God. But that's what we're saying, is according to you and your definition, when we're talking about nothing, we're talking about prior causal conditions. There's the absence of a causal condition, right? And we're saying that you can get something from no causal conditions. That's what they're arguing, right? If they're going to argue nothing, okay? Again, for the theist, we're not arguing that. We're saying, no, there is a cause, right? There are causal conditions, right? That's exactly what we're arguing. Does that make sense?
So a theist position is basically no material matter.
Yeah, so when we say Allah creates out of nothing, we're saying no material matter, all right? That's a theological position, all right? But the philosophical position, which is what the atheist is now arguing, because he can't take a theological position. Otherwise, that presupposes he already believes in God, right? So a philosophical position, no prior causal conditions. It just happens. There's an absence of conditions. There's absence of everything. Make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay, good. All right. So something coming from nothing is impossible. Nothing implies non-being, no potential, and no causal conditions. However, God is unique with the potential to create and brings things into existence. He provides, i.e., he provides causal activity. He has a will and he has a power, right? He has irada and he has qudra, all right? Therefore, it is not the case of something coming from nothing. God, wills, and power are the causal conditions to bring the universe into existence, all right? So hopefully that's clarified that contention. Does that make sense? Yes? Everyone good with that? You sure? I know it's early. Okay. All right. Let's go to the second option. So remember the ayah said, Am khuliqu min ghayri shay, am humul khaliqun. All right. So were they created from nothing, or did they create themselves? All right. Now this one is pretty. I think it's pretty straightforward. Okay. When a person would assert, if the second option is okay, we'll put nothing. We've already agreed that something can't come from nothing. Then did things create themselves? But there's a logical problem here, right? Because it preassumes the existence of something in order for that thing to exist, okay? So it's like a mother giving birth to herself, to put it very simply, all right? Which, again, is a logical impossibility, okay? So can something exist and not exist at the same time? Can your mother give birth to herself, all right? So, yeah, you get the mic real quick.
Actually, that's another argument you can argue against Christians, that when they believe that God is also Jesus, but how can God create Himself? Like, how can God be born but He already existed? That's another argument you can argue against them that too. I just want to mention it. I think it's great.
Jazakullahu Khairun. So Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi, he mentions this is even more fallacious. This is an even more fallacious argument, because if something does not exist, how can it be described as having power, and how could it create anything? How could it do anything? If these two arguments are refuted, then it is established that they have a creator, so let them believe in him. Okay? So again, the deductive form of the argument is this. All right? So we've covered, so basically, there are four options. So let's now look at this in a deductive format. Okay? If option 1 is not true, then you have to go to option 2. If option 2 is not true, then you go to option 3. If these three options, they're all false, option 4, by logical necessity, has to be true. All right? That's why we said that this is a deductive form of the argument. There is no other place, as long as 1, 2, and 3 have been dealt with, 4 necessarily has to be the resulting option. Okay? And that's why this argument is very straightforward and very powerful. Okay? So we've dealt with created from nothing. We've dealt with self-created. In fact, self-created is very, very straightforward. All right? So now, what if someone says, no, but it was created by something else that was created? All right? Because that's the third option. All right? So let's going back to the diagram. Or did they create the heavens and the earth? All right? So in other words, were they created from something else that it itself was created? All right? That's your third option. So again, if you remember the infinite regress of past events, that's an impossibility, because if that was the case, you wouldn't be here. We wouldn't exist, right? So to say that something was created from something which is created from something, and that went on forever, then the initial you would not exist. There has to be, by logical necessity, something outside of this chain that started the process, okay? And so, and by the way, this is Sheikh Jafar Idris. He said there would be no series of actual causes, but only a series of non-existence. The fact, however, is that there are existence around us. Therefore, their ultimate cause must be something other than temporal causes. Okay? And Imam al-Ghazali mentions the same can be said of the cause of the cause. now this can either go on ad infinitum, which is absurd, or it will come to an end. That being the case, it is the only option that it has to be created by something that itself was uncreated. All right? And so hence, the understanding that there's an uncreated creator is a logical necessity when you start weighing out all the other options that are competing against it. Okay? So, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, like He neither begets nor is He born. He is the first. There's nothing before you, as the dua in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet ﷺ mentions, "Oh God, you are the first. There's nothing before you. You are the last, and there's nothing after you." Okay, so that was the argument in a nutshell. So, any questions about that? How many people? Yeah. So let me get you the mic.
All right, so I just had a question with regards to the self-created portion of the argument.
Okay.
The self-created postulation.
Sure.
How would you deal with somebody that brings up arguments of let's say quantum particles, which are known to I believe either exist in two states or have existence and non-existence at the same time. So how would you deal with somebody that brings up the argument oh wait, quantum particles exist and don't exist at the same time?
Okay, then what do they mean by exist? You have to really get down and understand how are they defining exist, right? Is it a logical definition? Something is being and not being at the same time, right? Because again, it gets back to, I know we use these things in our vernacular, right? They exist and they don't exist, but what do you mean by that, right? So that's what I would say is that you really have to boil down and say, okay, what is it that you're referring to here, right? You want to add to that?
Sorry, I'd just like to comment on what you just said.
Sure, go
So
ahead.
this is actually a phenomenon that I studied recently because I'm a biochemistry student. So studying general chemistry, you cover the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And there's a fundamental understanding within this scientific fields that models don't explain reality. And this is something my professor reiterated multiple times throughout the course, is that these are all models, and it is, so many of them can be mathematically proven. Like in this situation where you're talking about how a quantum particle can exist and not exist at the same time, this has been mathematically proven.
Sure.
And to simplify it down, basically, there are atoms and then there are subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, and so electrons basically can exist in a specific position. Like imagine, Fahad, imagine you were standing right here, and rationally, in order for you to get to the other side of the room, you would have to move from this point and traverse every single position until you got to that point, right?
Sure.
But what an electron can do, actually, according to this model, is you can exist here and exist at that side of the room, but you can never exist anywhere in between, and you can actually move back and forth without ever existing at any position in between these two locations. Right. And that's been mathematically proven.
Sure.
But then again, it's just a model. And a model is not a clear explanation of reality because there are multiple scientific models, and they're always changing. They're mutable, like you mentioned.
Right.
So it's not always because if you're relying on this for your own explanation of reality, then you're gonna actually lead yourself into a bit of an issue because they're always changing.
Sure. But I would add to that. Now you mentioned that if it's a mathematical model, remember we said that certain things within mathematics are possible. You can have an infinite, right? But they're not possible within the physical world, right? So just because you can mathematically show, let's say, existence and non-existence at the same time, it doesn't model the physical world, right? And I think last night I'd mentioned that even mathematically, if I wanted to traverse the room, I'd have to go from this point to the door, which means I'd have to cross the halfway point, right? But then I'd have to cross the halfway point of the halfway point. But then I have to cross the halfway point of the halfway point of the half. So I would never be able to mathematically be able to cross the room, right? But physically I can get up and just walk over there. So mathematical models are very useful, like you mentioned, but at the same time, they don't necessarily reflect reality, right? So, and if that's where you're at, then be careful in that realm, inshallah.
See, that's exactly where I'm having the issue.
Okay.
Because I'm going to kind of go to calculus 2, right? If you take an integral of a certain period of time,
okay,
right, of something happening in that period of time, the probability of that happening is 0.
Okay, yeah.
Okay? But if you take an integral of something happening from the beginning to the end, the probability of that happening is a 1.
Okay.
Right? So that means that if you look at infinity, the probability of something happening in an infinite time span, there's a very high possibility that that thing would happen.
Okay. Okay. Jazakallahu Khair. Appreciate that. I'm not sure if I understood it, but Jazakallahu Khair.
So the point I'm making is, if you're traversing
right
from that side of the room
sure.
to that side of the room,
right.
if you look at an infinite period of time,
yeah.
that there's a possibility that you would traverse from that side of the room to that side of the room.
Right. But an actual infinite doesn't exist. Is that what you're saying? Like the actual infinite, like I would need an actual
But if you're talking
infinite,
about infinity, right?
Right.
Something happening forever.
Yeah.
That it could happen per mathematical.
Right, for a mathematical model. Right. But that's exactly what hopefully I articulated that well, is that mathematics doesn't necessarily represent the real world, right? So I don't know if that, again, I haven't studied that stuff in a long time. I think the last time I took a class on multivariable calculus was like 20 years ago. So it was a long time. So I'm going to trust you on that, inshallah. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break. I'm going to bring up the other slides. I need to actually find them. So get up, take a break, walk around, and we'll reconvene, inshallah, in 5 minutes. Jazakumullahu khair. Yeah, but
Assalamu alaikum. As we were setting things up with the presentation, I just came across some brothers from out of state, and I understand there's some sisters also from out of state. So since this is our last couple hours before the program ends, definitely wanted to make sure that any of you who are visiting first time or visiting from locally or out of state from first time, you can definitely, I would encourage you to take a tour of the seminary, the library, and other classrooms and so forth, alhamdulillah, before you head back home. So between now and Dhuhr, or immediately before Dhuhr, or immediately after Dhuhr, we have students here, both on this and volunteers on the sister side and the brother side. Just go up to myself or any of the volunteers and just ask. And I think it would be great, alhamdulillah, since you came out here to be able to see the seminary and all the classrooms, the library, the gym, and where do students usually study. Classes resume tomorrow morning because this is a weekend, obviously. But if you're in town this weekend, or Monday, I mean, you're more than welcome to come by and visit and audit some of the classes. If this weekend sparks some interest in studying, then you can take it to the next step by coming and visiting the seminary during the last week of our Arabic intensive is this week, inshallah. And also I want to, mashallah, just speaking of a few brothers here, our one-year program, our 11th batch of one-year students will be starting next Monday, a week from tomorrow. So if yourself or you know anyone else is interested in furthering the Islamic knowledge in Arabic, Islamic studies, Aqidah, Seerah, Fiqh, Tajweed, Tazkiyah, mentorship, public speaking, and a whole bunch of other things that are taught here for 11 months to both boys and girls, men and women, 7:40 to 4:15 every day, Monday through Friday. And then on Saturdays, we have a shorter day, 3 hours. This program, as I said, is in its 11th year. And we've graduated, alhamdulillah, hundreds of students. Just last year, about 75 or so graduated from across the country. We have about 75 enrolled, I think so, 670 or 75 enrolled for this year. So a lot of them are from out of state as well. So you might have been hearing about this program before, but you can get a chance to learn about it. The Tanweer Immersion Program. The website is quite detailed. It's got a lot of various aspects of the Tanweer program are highlighted on the website, but there's nothing like coming and sitting and seeing for yourself. So I recommend after the program ends to take a tour. Inshallah, Ahmad Javed is here, Marzouk, the other students will be here to take you around. And the sisters, inshallah, you can reach out to the volunteers. And then tomorrow, come by anytime next week or even the following week to audit a class or two, and that will help answer a lot of your questions. Jazakumullahu Khairun. Okay, now inshallah we're ready to take the sisters' questions. We have a few sisters' questions, so let's take those first.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulihil Kareem amma ba'd. Okay, so one question was, what does undifferentiated infinite mean? As far as I know, that is a mathematical concept, right? It's not a philosophical concept. So those who are mathematicians would probably be, are you familiar with what it means? Undifferentiated infinite. As far as I know, it's a mathematical concept. And so we already said that you can have an infinite mathematically. So and however you want to describe that, whatever sort of nuances that come with that, that's perfectly acceptable. But as far as it being an actual infinite, I don't think that has any sort of bearing on whether an actual infinite exists or not. So it is a mathematical concept, inshallah. Another question, if an atheist agrees with you that God is independent, then what about angels? If he can do anything with the snap of his fingers, then why do angels exist? So one thing we want to make sure that we're clear about is yesterday when we were speaking about the argument from dependency, it was solely looking at the fact that there has to, by necessity, be an independent, that the independent has to exist, right? Our belief in angels, is that a logical necessity? No. Okay, hopefully we're all okay. So this is a good chance to kind of review some of the aqidah. Okay, we know about angels because Allah tells us about angels. There's no sort of logical connection to say, okay, now because we believe Allah exists, therefore angels exist. That's not how that works, right? I think the question, which has now disappeared, but anyway, so the question asked, like, I guess, so why does Allah need angels? And so again, Allah doesn't need anything. That is his choice. Like how things functions are by way of angels. Like angels bring rain, angels take the soul of the dead person, and so on and so forth. As we know, that is a choice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that a logical necessity? No. But is it true? Yes. It is logically necessary that the existence of Allah by way of Him being an independent reality is there. What that entails then is that whatever revelation or whatever communication that independent reality has now put forth is true. Okay? And so therefore, I'm not, when I say something like, is it a logical necessity for angels to exist? Some people may say like, oh, so it's not logical? That's not what I'm saying. If we have come to the conclusion that Allah exists, then whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us about is a reality. Okay? So it's not that it's illogical, it's just how you get to that truth is a different process. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Any questions about that? Any clarification? All right, it's a foundational point of aqeedah, inshallah, which is a good question, though. Jazakallahu Khairun. Okay, so sisters, I think I'm connected. So did you have any other question before we move on to the next section? Okay. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Okay, wait. So I wasn't able to hear you properly. So if you could you repeat the question? I wasn't able to hear any of it. So if you could just repeat it. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. So, as far as I've understood the question, the sister is asking that while Allah does not have a gender, why does He refer to Himself as He? And in certain cases, we. And she said certain feminists would argue that in fact God is a she. Okay? Now, sister, could I ask you that we can park this question to the end? Actually, you know what? Let's not park it to the end since we are at the end of a section. Let me just go ahead and take it. So, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to Himself as He, this is a function of language. Any person that studied the Arabic language knows that it is a gendered language. It is the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicates. Does that necessitate gender as we understand it? No, it doesn't, but that's just how language works, right? It is a function of the language. Does it necessitate one being more dominant than the other? No, it doesn't. The problem that arises is that, and we spoke about worldviews some few days ago, it is the lenses by which you are looking at reality. If the lenses that you are looking at reality is a feminist lens, then yes, the choice of he would be something to say, okay, well, this is just substantiating and bolstering the idea of the tyrannical patriarchy that is found in all religious texts. But that's not the case. And we had said a few days ago that in fact Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has different classifications, different names and attributes, and some scholars classify them in two broad categories, right? You have names that are Jalali and names that are Jamali, right? Some scholars do this, right? So Jamali names are those names related to like beauty, okay? That's Jamal yani, okay? Jalali refer to those attributes that are related to majesty. So the attributes of Allah being, that He is powerful, He's strong and mighty, and so on and so forth, right? And He is Shadidul Iqab, and so on. Those are all Jalali, relating to Allah's majesty, okay? Then you have Jamali attributes. He is Ar-Rahim, Ar-Rahman, right? Al-Wudud, and so on and so forth. What's interesting is that within the human being, right, one of the things that Ibn al-Qayyim mentions is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants His servants to emulate some of His names, okay? Not that we're doing some sort of concept of we're going to become Allah. But as Ibn al-Qayyim says, Allah is Ar-Rahman and He loves for His servants to have mercy, right? Allah is Al-Alim and He loves for His servants to have knowledge, right? And so on. Allah is the Al-Adl, He's the one that is just, and He loves for His servants to have justice, right? In this concept where we see that we're trying to get closer to Allah by way of emulating Allah, certain people have been created with certain dispositions, with attributes that are stronger in certain areas. So when it comes to the attributes of Jamal, the female gender, by and large, has a leg up in terms of things like mercy, for instance. In fact, the term mercy, rahmah, comes from rahm, right? As we know from the prophetic narrations, right? So that concept that women have a leg up when it comes to mercy, okay, fair enough. But men have a leg up, let's say, when it comes to physical, biological power, right? By and large, these are generalities. I'm not saying this is always the case, but by and large. Now, does that mean that because there's this hierarchy in different attributes that there's some sort of concept of injustice? No. In fact, one of the most beautiful aspects of Islam is that it encourages families, these two genders, to come together, right? That they come together and complement one another. So when it comes to the worship of Allah, you are coming together and both of you are taking your strengths, helping each other with your weaknesses, and having an understanding of that. So when it comes to this concept of, okay, well, he referred to himself as he, it's actually a very shallow argument to say, okay, well, there's some sort of patriarchy that's hidden within the Quran, right? Yes, there is a difference between genders, but those differences do not mean a difference in value. Yesterday, I don't know if I had mentioned this, but I mentioned this in the khutbah I did. I said we believe in an equality of value, and we say that is not the same as an identicality of roles. These are two separate things. Equality of value, identicality of roles. These are two separate things. We believe in an equality of value. Allah has valued everyone equally. And that everyone has the opportunity to increase their value because that value is not contingent upon the color of your skin, your gender, your height, your age, your intelligence, none of that. What it's contingent upon, it is the level of taqwa, right? Inna akramakum indallahikum atqakum. Indeed, the most honored of you is the one that has the most taqwa. And taqwa is open to everyone, whatever your intellectual level is, whatever your height is, whatever your color is, whatever your ability is. It is open to everyone, right? But now, that being the case, equality of value is not the same as identicality of roles. Allah did not make us exactly the same. And one of the problems with the feminist movement itself was that they moved, if you study kind of the historical genealogy, first wave feminism was related to the concept of voting rights, okay? So we call women's suffrage. So by 1920s, in this country, they were given voting rights, but even that, it wasn't perfect, okay? So 1920s, most states said, okay, women can now vote. Although some states had said that the condition is that they have to own property, the problem is that the states didn't allow them to own property. So even the voting rights that were given, they were given in a very kind of loose way, right? And I always find this interesting, this is what I mentioned in the khutbah, is that political participation for women, and I know it's not the exact same when we talk about democratic participation, but women's suffrage actually comes 1,400 years late. Because when it came to political participation, the Prophet ﷺ actually took bay'ah, took an oath of allegiance, not only from the men, but also from the women, right? You remember when Hind comes to the Prophet ﷺ and she's complaining about her husband, Abu Sufyan, being stingy. When she came to him, that incident, the particular occurrence happens when she's coming to pledge the oath of allegiance, right? To give the bay'ah to the Prophet ﷺ, right? Now again, I know it's not the same democracy, that's not what I'm talking about, but I'm saying that whole concept of political engagement or having political participation, they were very late to do that. So first wave feminism, second wave feminism tries to deals with the concept of gender roles. If a man can do it, why can't a woman do it? All right? And this is a major faux pas because they have mixed the idea of equality of value and identicality of roles, right? And when you mix that up, what starts to happen? You start saying, well, if a man can work, I can work, right? If a man can do this, we should be able to do this. Okay, now let's ask the question. Should the standard be man? Because man is weak. Man has limitations. Or should the standard come from that which transcends man's weakness, the male weakness, which is Allah, right? So now the standard becomes, if a man does this, we're going to do this. Where is there a problem? In the realm of biology, right? So now you have the advent, like 1960, you have the birth control pill, that gets instituted, the FDA approves it, 1973, Roe versus Wade, okay? Abortion becomes legalized. All of that happens because of this major mistake between mixing of equality of value, identicality of roles. This entire concept, and I've entered into the conversation of liberalism, so I'll conclude this quickly. This entire concept that we are hammered with, all men are created equal. That is an assumption of liberalism. Any worldview will not even be able to justify that. So remember we talked about philosophical naturalism? How do you justify human beings being created equal biologically? We're not. In fact, you justify the exact opposite. We are unequal, right? That's the whole concept of survival of the fittest and all of that. You have to have an unequal, biology to be able to survive and evolution take place. So that assumption of every human is equal from a philosophical, naturalistic worldview, you can't substantiate it, right? And in essence, we are not. That is not the state of nature. We are not identical. We have different heights and weights and intellectual ability. That's not the case. But is our value equal? In that case, we could say yes. And why we can say that with confidence is because our value, as we mentioned, comes from that which transcends limited mind and human emotion, which is Allah, right? If someone were to equate value to the human being and say God doesn't exist, how would you substantiate that, right? Like we spoke about, was it yesterday, I think, okay? So anyways, that was my tirade on this question, so my apologies. It's one of the things I'm dealing with more nowadays. Okay. Let's go ahead and start with our next topic, inshallah. And that is basically, whoa, that's going a little fast. What we've termed linguistic miracle of the Quran for non-Arabic speakers. Okay, so what is the goal of this section is that we're going to provide a case where we want to say that the Quran is from Allah. Now, one of the contentions that people may come up with, because you say, look, if you read the Quran and you know Arabic, you will be able to see by way of your reading and by way of appreciating the linguistic nuances, all of those things, you will come to the conclusion that it is from Allah, all right? Or when it comes to the idea of contradictions, right? So sometimes someone will come up with they'll try to throw a contradiction at you, and one of the responses is, well, you're taking two translations of the Quran and coming up with a contradiction, but they're different things that we're talking about here. So the contention is, well, I don't know Arabic, so isn't that unfair of God to want me to find a contradiction but not allow me to have the tools to find the contradiction? Do you get where this contention comes up for? And other areas, right? So bring a Quran like it. Well, why does it have to be in Arabic? And so that would necessitate I have to learn Arabic. And so therefore God is unfair because I speak English and, I have this idea of absolute Americanism and English is the best language in the world, whatever, right? Like, why should I learn another language? All of that comes into play. Okay, so in response to that, this is what we're going to be speaking about. How to show the Quran is from Allah without reference to the Arabic language, okay? So here's the structure of the argument, all right? Now it's divided into two broad categories. One category is what we call inabitability, all right? And the second category is authorship. So the first category of inabitability is we're talking about the fact that the Quran cannot be emulated or imitated. The second category is we're asking the question, who is the author of the Quran? And this will also come about as a deductive argument, all right? We will have options. So for instance, we're going to say there's only a few limited options in terms of who authored the Quran. Either it was Allah, either it was the Prophet ﷺ, either it was an Arab, or either it was a non-Arab. There's no fifth option, right? So if you can eliminate three of those options and leave Allah as the only option, deductively you have shown that the author of the Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all right? So let's take a look at the structure of the argument in detail now, bi'idhnillah, okay? Number one, so here's the points. The Quran presents a literary and linguistic challenge to humanity, right? Bring a Quran like it, bring 10 surahs like it, bring an ayah like it, so on and so forth. You're all familiar with this, right? Surah Al-Baqarah and different places, okay? Number two, the 7th century Arabs were best placed to challenge the Quran. Okay, so the Quran comes down at a language and a specific epoch and a specific spatial boundary, which is 7th century Hijaz, 7th century Arabian Peninsula. So, if we understand how languages work and that they change over time, we say the best people equipped to deal with that challenge is going to be people at that epoch in that place. Okay? And we'll get into more details about that. Number 3, what we're going to see is those people failed to meet the challenge. Okay? Number 4, scholars have testified to the Quran's inabitability. We'll get into a little bit about the concept of testimony. And 5, counter-scholarly testimonies are not plausible as they have to reject established background information. We'll get into all of these things. Right now we're just presenting the structure of the argument. If we've understood 1 through 5, we will say that the Quran is inimitable, right? You cannot emulate it. You cannot bring a Quran like it, okay? So now, the possible explanation for the Quran's inimitability are authorship by an Arab, non-Arab, the Prophet ﷺ, or Allah. Again, in a deductive format, it could not have been, so the conclusion is, it could not have been produced by an Arab, non-Arab, or the Prophet ﷺ. Therefore, the best explanation is that it's from God. That is the structure of the argument, all right? This is where we're going to get into a lot of details. So I need you to pay attention and give me your full focus, inshallah. Okay. Let's start with the intellectual challenge, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِمَّا نَزَّلْنَا عَلَى عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ. Right? So if you are in doubt about what we have sent down to our servant, then bring a chapter like it, right? وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ, and enlist whatever helpers, supporters that you have other than Allah, if you truly think you can. The challenge is what? If you're in doubt, bring a Quran like it. Okay? Everyone clear about the challenge? Right? The tahaddi? Okay. So, let's look at some of the views related to this challenge, or let's look at some views about the Quran, some testimonial references. So, Bruce Lawrence, in his book, The Quran, a Biography, he writes, as tangible signs, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning layered with meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Imam Fakhruddin, right, and this is cited in Al-Itqan fil Ulum al-Quran, he says it is inimitable because of its eloquence, its unique style, and because it is free of error. Okay, now these are just testimonies. All right, H.A.R. Gibb, very famous historian. Like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of language and rhetoric. Well, then, if the Quran were his own composition, other men could rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it. If they could not, and it is obviously that they could not, then let them accept the Quran as an outstanding evidential miracle. All right, now, there are some... Okay, so what are we saying now? Number 1, we're saying that the Arabs were the best place to challenge the Quran. Right? Why is that the case? Why that's the case is because the 7th century Arabs achieved linguistic mastery over the Arabic language. All right? So as Ibn Rashiq mentions, he says the Arabs used to congratulate each other only on the birth of a child or when a poet rose amongst them. Language in that particular environment was the main tool of pretty much anything. Your status was based on how eloquent you are, how well-versed you are with the language, how articulate you were, and so on and so forth, right? So the experts within the Arabic language of that time period were the Arabs of that time period, okay? And that is well known by way of testimony, okay? All right. So if we understand that they had achieved linguistic mastery at that time, all right? And we know this because of testimonial knowledge, which we'll talk about in a little bit. If that is the case, did the Arabs at the time of the Prophet ﷺ meet the challenge? That's the question, all right? Now, what we're going to look at is that we know that they didn't meet the challenge from a few epistemic tools that we've been talking about, okay? One is that they didn't meet the challenge based on testimonial knowledge, which we said was fundamental to epistemology, all right? We said how you know what you know, most of that comes from the say-so of others. As we mentioned with a lot of detail, we spoke about how do you know your mother is your mother, how do you know the world is round. We said that without testimony, those are things that you cannot know, right? So there's testimony, but then there's also the idea of historicity. Okay, and we'll get into that in just a second. Okay, so before we get there, let's understand testimony and let's understand inference. These are two philosophical concepts. Testimony, I think we've covered in quite some detail. So we've already said that it is a valid and indispensable source of knowledge. We asked the question, whether it was yesterday or day before yesterday, I'm blurring now, right? Is the world flat? All right? So by the way, how many people were here yesterday? Okay, so most of you were. Okay. So yesterday, if you want to remind us, how did this particular idea of the world being flat, what does that have to do with testimony? What were we trying to show yesterday? And let me get you a mic, inshallah.
Basically, you said that how we know the world is not flat because other people have told us that it's not flat.
Right, so we know the world is round,
Yeah.
but the challenge was that, and this is the challenge I made to everyone, can you know that the world is round without reference to testimony, without knowledge from the say-so of somebody else, right? And we know that no one has flown out of the earth, at least in this room, so therefore you are dependent upon the say-so of somebody else, right? The pictures that you see of the world being round, you didn't take that picture. You have to trust the one that took the picture, right? We asked the question about, how do you know your mother's your mother? And the only way you know that is by way of testimony, right? And I think someone mentioned like a picture. And I was like, wow, someone actually took a picture. That's interesting. But anyways, but even the picture, you'd have to trust the person who took the picture. So a fundamental part of how you know, in fact, I would argue most of what you know comes from testimonial knowledge. It is an indispensable source of knowledge. If you did not have testimony, most of what you know, you wouldn't know. Okay? Fundamentally. All right. So now we want to explore some academic testimonies, and then we'll say that why there's counter testimonies, right? In terms of the inabitability of the Quran. So let's look at testimony. Well, these are some quotes about testimony. Concerned with how we acquire knowledge and justified belief from the say-so of other people, many of us have neither seen a baby born, nor have most of us examined the circulation of the blood. Yet, we know that the blood circulates by way of reference of somebody else, right? Of writings or whatever it might be. Okay. All right, so testimony is fundamental. We've already spoken about this, and there's other references you can look at. So Dr. Elizabeth Fricker, she actually studies testimony and epistemology in quite some detail. She has a lot of lectures on YouTube. You can check it out. She talks about epistemic limitations, right? So for instance, we know we have epistemic limitations and we rely on the skills of other people, is what her area of expertise is, because we understand that we cannot know everything. And we expand our epistemic limits by the knowledge and say-so of other people, right? So she gives examples of, I'm not a mechanic, I take my car to the mechanic, I rely on that mechanic's knowledge. If I'm not a doctor, I rely on the knowledge of the doctor, and thus I've expanded my epistemic limitations, right? So Dr. Elizabeth Fricker, she speaks about that. Keith Lair, he has some work on testimony and trustworthiness, if you're interested. And there's another one by Benjamin McMyler on the right to referral. The reason I'm mentioning these resources, the academic resources, is because when you're having a conversation with someone, you know, they may think that like testimony is just something that's, you know, that's just a weak way of acquiring knowledge. When in fact, philosophically, it has a profound importance in how you know what you know, right? And so it's good to kind of read some of the references from Western academia itself, inshallah. Okay. All right, so we already talked about that. Let's take a look at some academic testimonies about the Quran. All right, so notwithstanding, so this is Shah Waliullah Delwi, rahimahullah, in Al-Fawz Al-Kabir fi Rasul Al-Tafsir. By the way, do you guys study that text here? For those of you, there's no 7th students here, 7th year students here. No, okay, anyway, khair, inshallah. So, notwithstanding the literary excellence of some of the long pre-Islamic era poems, the Quran is definitely on a level of its own as the most eminent written manifestation of the Arabic language. All right, that's just testimony. Naved Kermani, Poetry and Language, he writes, obviously the Prophet ﷺ succeeded in this conflict with the poets, otherwise Islam would not have spread like wildfire. Okay, So now let's take a look at this. Well, so we have testimonies. Now someone's going to argue, okay, just because someone said it doesn't mean it's true. Obviously, you're going to have counter testimonies, right? Simply saying someone said it and therefore it's true, that's not what we're saying. We're saying when you look at the testimonies, we have testimonies that are showing and stating that the Quran was inimitable, right? And we just read some of them. We also have counter testimonies, okay? Point being is if you can negate the counter testimonies, the testimonies for the Quran being inimitable stand. Does that make sense? Okay? So let's get through some of the counter testimonies, right? So, number one, we'll look at when we look at counter testimonies, we'll see that there are absurd implications. In order for those counter testimonies to stand, to be valid, they have to reject all of, or most, or a big section of Arabic literary history. All right? They would also need to claim greater linguistic ability than the 7th century Arab linguist, and they'd have to deny the challenge of the Quran. All right? So, let's take a look at these one at a time. What do I mean by absurd implications? What I mean is the challenge that comes up in Surah Al-Baqarah, it comes up at a certain epoch of time, right? So this is after the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, okay? And this is around the time of the Battle of Badr, right? So we know this. Now, this challenge has come, and it's come to the Arabs. If you think about this, does it seem plausible that someone could meet the challenge because they have all of the linguistic tools to do so, and they are the only ones that have the linguistic tools to do so, as we're going to see, meet the challenge and not go to war? Or does it make sense to say, you know what, let's go to war instead of meeting the challenge? Because remember, war is expensive. There are economic implications. You lose a lot of money. You lose life. It is difficult. No one likes war. Human beings don't want to go fight and have the chance of dying. Does it make sense to say, instead of meeting the challenge, the Arabs said, let's go to war? Does that make sense? It is absurd to think so, okay? So we know that the Arabs didn't meet the challenge because if they had met it, or if they had done that, they wouldn't have gone to war. It is absurd to think so. Now, someone may say, okay, you're saying that the Arabs went to war. How do we know that? That goes to the second point. If you say that that never occurred, you have to reject all of Arabic literary history, meaning whatever history comes out of that time period, you have to reject it all. But if you're going to reject that, you have to reject any sort of historical methodology in any sphere of any history. That is also absurd. Okay? So now, the other counter testimony would be, okay, yeah, go ahead. Let's get the mic, yeah.
Yeah, so I understood the point about rejecting the Arabic literary history, but then I also had a question because I've seen this a lot of times, especially at university, where a lot of, I believe, misguided people would write down, when talking about Islamic literary history as, quote, Islamic legends. As in, they just dismiss everything, the entire tradition, as just a quote-unquote legend or a fable.
Sure.
How do you respond to that kind of blatant lie?
You respond by saying, just be consistent. If you're going to reject Arabic literary history, you have to reject all literary history, right? Because, again, what tools do you have for the preservation of that history? If you study history within Western academia, within academic institutions, the methodology of how you preserve history, right? Historiography, in fact, is much weaker than how we have preserved history, right? So you have not only, in addition to the history, you have the hadith tradition, which has a very robust, sophisticated system, and that is not how historians within the Western framework or academic framework work. So you have a system, in fact, that is stronger. So if you're going to reject that system, your weaker system, by necessity, you have to reject it. So you can't say anything about any history from that perspective, right? I mean, even go back 200 years, Maybe you have, like, let's say the Constitution, but then how do you know, again, if you're going to go down that route of radical skepticism, well, how do you know Thomas Jefferson, XYZ, penned the Declaration of Independence or whatever it might be, right? That's why I'm saying it's absurd, right? The implications are absurd. And so if you're going to say that, just be consistent. Does that make sense?
Gotcha.
Yeah. So can we get the mic over there?
Assalamu alaikum. Not to go down a rabbit hole, but as Muslims, obviously, we readily accept or can appreciate the fact that the 7th century Arabs were the most qualified to accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's challenge.
Sure.
But if I'm a regular atheist today, they would have a huge problem with that, because they would say, as a society based on testimonial knowledge or experiential knowledge or culmination of everything that we've learned as a society,
sure,
it must be true that some people should be at least equal or more qualified than the 7th century Arabs, because the 7th century Arabs were very simple people. So why is it that, how do we prove to them that the 7th century Arabs actually were the most qualified to take on that challenge? And also,
okay, so I'm going to get to that in a second, but okay.
Okay. And then the second part, and this may be a dumb argument, but they might say, because we do know that there are people that attempted it, right? They did come up with
We're going to get to that as well.
Garbage surahs or whatever they.
So hold on to that, because once I'm done, I think that'll clarify that. Okay. Right now we're just right now we're just saying that if we're going to say that the challenge wasn't met and the alternative was going to war, you'd have to say, you know what, either you're going to have to reject all of Arabic literary history, but then you have to be consistent in that, right? Because no one chooses war over just simply meeting a challenge and calling it a day. It just doesn't make sense, right? Okay. What? Okay. Well, whatever you want to call them, I'm not going to get into that. Okay. Now, the third aspect of this counter-testimony is that you have to claim greater linguistic ability than the 7th century Arab linguists. Problem is, when you study the philosophy of language, and we understand that languages change over time, okay? This is something that's well known. The English we speak today is not the English that was spoken 200 years ago, okay? The Arabic that's spoken today is not the Arabic that was spoken at the time of the Prophet ﷺ in the 7th century, okay? And for anyone who speaks Arabic, you know this very well. The Ammiya, is very different than Fusha, okay? Now, the question is, if we understand that there is the Arabic language of the 7th century, and we understand that the Arabs of the 7th century were the ones that spoke the language, that lived the language, that knew the language, right? When a person makes a claim that we can now meet the challenge, they would have to say, I can have greater linguistic ability than those people. Does everyone understand this point? Okay. Why is that a problem? Because from that period of time, there's a relative homogeneity. In other words, the Arabs did not necessarily go out en masse until Islam comes, right? They were relatively an insular community. Civilizations came by, said, yo, that's hot, I'm not going to deal with that, who cares about the desert? And they kept going, right? So they were relatively insular. They celebrated the language, as we said, by way of our testimonial knowledge. Language was celebrated. It was a major occupation and preoccupation, right? In and out. So language was very, very important to their society. Now, because they're living in a homogeneous environment, you don't find linguistic depreciation. Until Islam comes, wars happen, and Islam starts to spread. That is when you find that, okay, hold on a second, the language has now started to change. And that is why many of the people of the time, very early on amongst the Sahaba, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Umar ibn Khattab, saw this immediately and started saying, we have to preserve the way to understand the language. That's why the stuff you study now, the Nahu, the Sarf, the Balagha, all that stuff that you guys are enjoying studying, that has to do with an understanding that the language is now changing and we need to establish a normative standard of the language. Otherwise, this is going to be problematic. Okay? That being the case, if someone is going to say that the challenge has been met, Number one, we understand the challenge was not met by the connoisseurs, the main experts of the language at that time. Everyone who is outside of that epoch, who comes afterwards, cannot claim the same linguistic ability. So by default, you don't have the tools to meet the challenge. Does that make sense? Everyone understand that? Okay. Can I get to the last point? Let me finish, and then I'll open up for questions, okay? Okay, so when we deny the challenge of the Quran, or when people deny the challenge of the Quran, they're only left with a certain number of options. So again, they would have to have absurd implications, right? By rejecting Arabic literary history, they would have to claim greater linguistic ability than the 7th century Arab linguists. Let me add to this a little bit. Number one, you're talking about the epoch of time and language depreciating over time, okay? The other aspect is that even the people that are trying to, let's say, well, actually, I'm going to park that discussion. What was your question? Go ahead and get in the mic.
Not to go down a messy rabbit hole, but again, I'm thinking from the perspective of somebody who doesn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, somebody who lives in an English-speaking country. Sure. He would say, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided this challenge and then he limited the parameters of the challenge such that I'm at a huge disadvantage being 1400 years later, sure, that's a very unfair challenge, and it just doesn't sound convincing to them. Whereas,
well, so there's two things here. The morality of the challenge, which is a separate conversation, right? So we say, look, you know what? Hang on to your morality question. We'll get to that when we talk about objective morals. Okay, that's a separate question, right? The argument itself stands whether you think it's moral or immoral, right? Because now we're conflating.
No, I'm not talking about morality. I'm just
no, you are, because you're saying, well, that wouldn't be fair. That's a moral statement. It's not fair for God to give a challenge and then not give you that's a moral question, right?
Yes, but then that would basically suggest that if there's this God that you believe in that's supposed to be all just and fair, right? You, Mr. Muslim, just proved that your God is not fair.
Well, these are two separate conversations, right? We can get to that conversation, that's fair, but right now we're just talking about the authorship of the Quran, right? We'll get to that topic. We can talk about that. Just park it. Let me get through my point, and then we'll talk about is it fair, is it not fair, and how do we understand morals and meta-ethics, and we can talk about all those things. But that's not what I'm arguing here. And in fact, all I'm saying is who authored the Quran. That's it, sure, right? Now, if it's unfair, fine. I'll give it to you. Okay, it's unfair. God is unfair. Fair enough. But still, right, what I'm trying to show is that the Quran is from Allah, right? If you want to say he's unfair, for now, I'll give it to you. Take it.
Just one little tidbit. For the people that actually attempted it, what was the reference point? Who made the decision that you did come up with a bunch of verses that sounds like the Quran or better than the Quran? Who was the authority to say, yes, you met the challenge or you didn't?
I mean, the Arabs of the 7th century. Had they met the challenge, right, they wouldn't have gone to war.
So it was more of a communal thing?
Of course. Language is a part of what we call social ontology, okay? It has to be communal. Just like money is part of social ontology, it has to be communal, right? Like everyone has to have some sort of kind of an unspoken social contract to accept currency, right? Is part of what we call social ontology. Language works the same way, right? It has to be communal. Like in order for us to communicate, we all have to have some sort of, whether it's direct or indirect, understanding that this word means this. So it's not about an authority, it's about, well, this is part of the communal nature of how language works.
So last part, I apologize, and I'm taking a lot of time. If an Orientalist today comes back and says, I read Shakespeare and this sounds more beautiful and more magnificent than the translation of Abdullah Ali of the Quran.
Yeah, so again, let's just park that, right? Because that's not even part of our argument about how the Quran sounds, right? That's not what we're arguing. We're not saying that it's from Allah because it sounds good, right? That's not even part of the argument. Yes, can you get the mic, inshallah?
Bismillah. May Allah make it easy.
I mean,
so basically, I think the selection was not only based on the language, because Allah select Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as a Mustafa, and He said, وما أرسلناك إلا رحمة للعالمين. والنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم said that إنما بعثت لأتمم مكارم الأخلاق. So basically the selection was based the akhlaq first, and Allah select the best human in akhlaq.
Sure.
And also the society for the Arab at that time, they consider akhlaq is really important.
Sure.
So it was language and manner and
Sure.
akhlaq.
Sure.
So I think that's can answer brother question or assumption about the
Perhaps.
language.
Perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps.
I'll have to think about that. I don't know. Okay, let's get back to the structure of the argument, and maybe some of those things will be clarified. If not, then we'll move on, inshallah. Okay, let's move on. So we have to talk about inference now. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about testimony. Let's move on to inference. Now, what do we mean by inference? So inference, Peter Lipton defines it as such. So he says the doctor infers, the doctor infers that his patient has measles since this is the best explanation of the evidence before him. The astronomer infers that the existence of the motion of Neptune, since that is the best explanation of the observed perturbations of Uranus. Given our data and our background beliefs, we infer what we would, if true, provide the best of the competing explanations we can generate of those data. Now, I'm going to kind of summarize what he says and kind of explain what he says, okay? We, as human beings, use inference to the best explanations to come to conclusions, okay? What do I mean by inference? And what do we mean inference to the best explanation? Let's assume now, do you guys have Takis here? Takis? Those really, you guys have that here? Okay. Maybe I'll make it easy for you. Anyway, so I personally, I can't stand them, not necessarily because how they taste, but just that orange nastiness that comes up on your fingers is terrible, right? Anyway, my son loves them, all right? My second-born, Abdurrahman, he's huge. And so imagine now that we buy a number of bags of Taki chips, okay? These Taki chip, Takis or Takis, I'm not even, there's, I think, ikhtilaf on how to pronounce it. But anyway, I'll go with Takis, okay? We buy a whole bunch of bags because we're having guests over, and I tell Abdurrahman, I say, look, these Takis, I'm putting them in the pantry, don't touch them, okay? But because Abdurrahman is Abdurrahman, and if you know my son, yeah, he really wants those Takis, right? Anyways, so I told him, I said, look, Abdurrahman, don't touch the Takis, don't even think about it, don't even look at them, okay? Otherwise, you're going to be in deep trouble, okay? Now, I come back like an hour later, and I see Abdurrahman. He's on the couch, and he's passed out, all right? And he's lying down, and I see his fingers, and they're totally orange. And you see this orange, that grossness that comes from the chips all over his mouth too, all right? And I see that there's this trail of that orange nastiness that goes right into the pantry. And I see an open bag of chips. All right. Here's the thing. There are actually a few explanations of this. All right. Explanation number one. My older son, Abdullah, he said, you know what? This is a great opportunity to really stick it to Abdurrahman. Okay? So basically, he took Abdurrahman, knocked him out, threw him on the couch, crushed up some Takis, put it on his mouth, put it on his fingertips, had the path all the way, opened the bag of Takis, and left it like that. And he's like, ha, 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 right? Explanation number one. Explanation number two. Abdurrahman really wanted those chips. He went in, opened the bag, ate it, and kept on eating it until the couch and then passed out. All right? Two explanations. Which is the more likely explanation? Right? The second one. That is what we call inference to the best explanation. When you have competing explanations, you infer the best one. Does that make sense? So that's essentially what he's saying. Doctors do this all the time. They have a number of competing explanations. They infer to the best explanation. Make sense? Okay, good. Okay, now, that being the case, what we're going to say is that the inference to the best explanation... Okay, go ahead. Let's get the mic over there. And while you're doing that, Actually, after you do that, I'm going to ask the sisters if they have a question. Go ahead.
In that example, how do you know which explanation is the best explanation?
Well, what do you think? How do you think, as a father, how would I?
Which I'm not.
I mean, would you go with explanation number one?
Probably number two.
Number two, okay. So then why? It's an inference, right? You inferred based on previous historical experience and so on and so forth. There's a number of information and background and all these things, your experience as a father, blah, 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 blah. All of that leads to you saying, okay, this is the best explanation, right? And like I say, doctors do this based on their background knowledge. They say, okay, we have these particular symptoms or whatever it might be, but based on our background knowledge, we know that we infer that this is the best explanation, okay? So what we're saying here is that the inference we're making is that, look, you could say that all of Arabic literary history was just total, nonsense, but we've already debunked that. But even when you look at it from the inference of the best explanation, the inference is that the Arabs were not able to meet the challenge, okay? Even if you entertain other explanations. But because we work with a process of inference, we've inferred that. And we've shown that counter testimonies are categorically untrue. Why? Because to infer them would be problematic. It leads to absurd implications. All right? Is that clear so far? Everyone understand inference? Everyone's down with testimony? We're good? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so where are we? So if you remember the structure of the argument, we said there are two parts: inabitability, authorship. Okay? So what we're saying, what we've covered so far, we've covered point one: the Quran presents a literary and linguistic challenge to humanity. Bring a Quran like it. The 7th century Arabs were best placed to challenge the Quran. We've covered why. The 7th century Arabs failed to do so. We said, why do we know this, right? In the sense of testimonies and counter-testimonies. Then we said scholars have testified to the Quran's inadmissibility. We gave some of those testimonies. Counter-scholarly testimonies are not plausible. We mentioned that why they're not plausible. And so what we've said now, therefore, based on 1 to 5, that the Quran is inimitable. Okay? That's all we've established. We haven't established who the author is. All we've established was that the challenge was not met. In other words, it was not met. Okay, so that's clear so far? So far, so good? Okay, good. Let's move on to the authorship. All right? All right, so now let's look at the first option. So we have a few options here. Either the Quran, right, in terms of, okay, we've established it's inimitable, but there's only a few options. Either it came from an Arab authored it, or a non-Arab, or the Prophet ﷺ, or it came from Allah. Any other options? Yes. Sorry? An alien. Okay. So then I'd refer you back to philosophical naturalism. Again, if you're going to make absurd, okay, it could have been an alien, but then it could be a lot of things, right? Well, we're saying, based on inference, right, there are only 4 plausible explanations, right? The authorship can only be in one of these 4. If you want to add aliens, that's going to be a bit... Aliens could go under non-Arab, sure. I like that. Jazakullahu Khairun. Unless they were Arab aliens. All right. Anyway, so the multiverse and all that, right? Okay, anyway. Okay, so let's move on. So, based on a deductive form of the argument, we're saying that it could only have been an Arab, non-Arab, the Prophet ﷺ, or Allah. So now let's test all of these one by one. Okay, number 1. Could it have been an Arab? We've already shown that it was not an Arab of the 7th century. Okay? So for instance, Walid ibn Mughira, right? One of the worst, most vicious enemies of Islam. He says, he's quoted as saying, "For what can I say? For I swear by Allah, there is none amongst you who knows poetry as well as I do, nor can any compete with me in composition or rhetoric, not even in the poetry of the jinn. And yet I swear by Allah, Muhammad's speech," he's referring to the Quran, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "does not bear any similarity to anything I know, and I swear by Allah, the speech that he says is very sweet, and it is adorned with beauty and charm." Okay? Now this is one testimony. There are multiple testimonies, right? So we understand that the Arabs of that time did not meet the challenge because we have testimony from that time and because of Arab literary history. Again, they would not have gone to war if they felt they met the challenge, okay? So could it have been an Arab? Meaning, could it have been an Arab of the 7th century? Let's qualify that. No. Could it have been an Arab that came after the 7th century? Why? The linguistic tools, right? If the language is now depreciated, right, outside of that particular epoch of time, if an Arab of the 7th century who has all of the linguistic tools, right, and are connoisseurs of language, at the apex was not able to meet the challenge, how can an Arab who lives outside of that apex or that epoch meet the challenge? So someone who lives in, let's say, Syria or Jordan or Saudi or whatever today, they don't have the linguistic tools, right? So linguistically, as we said, languages depreciate. We know that very clearly, okay? So therefore, could it have been an Arab of that time or of modern day? Yes? No? Where are we, people? Okay, no. It's very light, kind of like, no. like, unless someone has doubts based on what we've said. So, yes or no? No. Okay. Could it have been a non-Arab? That's even more problematic, right? Why? Because not only is there a problem of language depreciating, but now Arab becomes a second language. And for those who study second languages, they are never as good as your mother tongue, ever, no matter how much you study it. I can tell you from someone who's been studying Arabic for a long time, I will never, ever, ever be able to match someone in terms of my, let's say, muhadatha and things like that, how I speak, with someone who has been born in an Arab household, has spoken it their entire life. It will never happen, right? So for a non-Arab, if an Arab can't meet that challenge, most definitely someone who has Arabic as a second language, even if you consider they've studied the grammar and all those things, they wouldn't be able to meet the challenge either. Make sense? Okay. Could it have been the Prophet ﷺ? Okay, well, logically, he was an Arab, so that settles that, okay? Because he's in the category of being an Arab, ﷺ. But now, kind of just in terms of some bolstering evidence, right? So this is not, so the primary thing is, he was an Arab, and so we already said it couldn't have been an Arab, okay? But also, there's the point about after their initial accusations, the Arab linguists never accused him of being the author. So not only was it that he's in the category of being an Arab, he was never accused by the 7th century Arabs of being the author. Number two, the Quran is a literary masterpiece, right? And when you go back to, did the Prophet ﷺ have any sort of evidence of poetry before the Quran, you don't find any sort of evidence of that, okay? In terms of, he was not known as a poet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's also what we call psycholinguistic content, all right? Let's take a look at that. So there's a study that was done, and again, this is bolstering evidence. This is not, I'm not saying this is the reason why it could have been the Prophet ﷺ. We've already said, logically, he was an Arab. We already said Arabs couldn't have emulated it. This case is solved. We're just giving a bolstering study, something additional, right, to drive the point home. So there was a literary study that was done, okay? And in this study, let me give you some background to it. They analyzed the entire Quran and the entire words and grammatical structures of the Quran. And they took hadith literature and analyzed all of the words and grammatical structures of hadith literature and then compared how similar they are, okay? They had certain qualities and certain parameters by which they tried to match how similar is the speech, the two types of speech, okay? So, results of all experiments have led to two main conclusions. First, the two investigated books, here I think they're referring to Sahih al-Bukhari and the Quran, should have different authors. Number two, all segments that are extracted from a unique book appear to have a certain stylistic similarity. So elements within the Quran are stylistically similar. Elements within Sahih al-Bukhari are stylistically similar. Okay? So consequently, we conclude, according to this investigation, that the Quran was not written by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and that it belongs to a unique author. In other words, when they looked at how much similarity there is between how the language is structured in the Quran and how much it is structured, how it is structured within, let's say, a hadith, they said that, for instance, similarities range from, let's say, 32%. Okay? Now, 32% is not conclusive to say this is the author of this book. In other words, most of the language was different. The structure of the language, how things were put, and so on and so forth. Vocabulary was different. The vocabulary of the Quran, unless the Prophet ﷺ was quoting the Quran, was different. Okay? Anyways, this is just a study. You can check it out. It's called Author Discrimination Between the Holy Quran and the Prophet's Statements. Halim's Sayyid, Literary and Linguistic Computing, Volume 27, number 4. You can check that out, inshallah. Okay. Now, someone said, as you had mentioned, what about Shakespeare, right? Now, one of the problems that arises when we're comparing Shakespeare is that Shakespeare had the benefit of editing. He could go back, edit, come back, reformulate, go back. The issue with the Quran is that there's no concept of editing. When an ayah comes, it comes. So to compare Shakespeare, who has a process of editing, to a revelation that comes back in a specific time period, and we know this by way of asbab al-nuzul and other things, you can't compare the two based on that very fact. There was no second editing, third editing. How does this formulate? In other words, when a person is going to compose something, they have to kind of go back over and over again when they're going to compose something, right? Yes, some people can compose poetry right off the bat, and the Arabs were known for that. In many cases, an incident would happen, and they would come up with a poem. But if someone wants to perfect their poetry, there's going to be an editing process, which Shakespeare has. He has a whole history of studying language, studying rhetorical devices, for instance. We know Shakespeare studied that for years before his poems actually became something of value within the Western literary tradition. All right? So you're comparing apples and oranges. Yeah, let's get a mic over here.
Wouldn't abrogation also count as editing?
Sorry?
Wouldn't abrogation of like certain verses count as editing?
In a sense, it could, but the other thing we're saying is that it's not only that it was on the spot, but it was sustained over 23 years, right? And so if there's consistency over 23 years, you've got another problem when it comes to comparing to Shakespeare, because that consistency isn't found in Shakespeare, okay? Because look, human beings over time, when you age, you experience things differently in a different way, and you're going to express things differently, right? Any author, you have a book that's written when they were like, let's say 20 versus a book they're written when they're 50, you're going to notice a bunch of different things. Addition in vocabulary, for instance, right? So things that I wrote when I was in my 20s and things that I wrote right now are drastically different, right? Just from the fact that I have a greater vocabulary usage. I know other things. I have different experiences that formulate how I'm going to express things, right? That's not the case with the Quran, because there's a consistency, a stylistic consistency, right? Any other questions? Right, and that's a good point too. Linguistic editing versus editing of content, right? So yeah, I think that's a good point. Jazakullahu Khair. So editing meaning like, when we talk about abrogation, this is content. But I think, brother, the issue is that that would also fall under linguistic editing as far as the Quran goes. So I'm not sure if that point would, because there could be both. So, Allahu Alam. Okay. All right. So therefore, to simply put, the only option is that it comes from Allah. All right? Now, bolstering evidence for this, the text itself is telling you it's coming from Allah. Right? So then it's like, okay, well, the author lied. You know, bolstering evidence, right? Tanzilu min Rabbil Alameen. It is a revelation from the creator of the Lord of the heavens and the earth, and so on, right? Over and over and over again. It's making a claim. So not that that's the primary evidence, but by way of deductive reasoning, we've seen that the Quran, the best explanation is that it comes from Allah. All right? So that's the argument in a, as best as I can put it. Any questions about that? Okay, let's get the mic here.
Is it possible if you can go back a few slides?
No. No, I'm just kidding. Which slide do you want to go to?
Go more forward. Yeah, that one.
Okay. That was it?
No, another one after that.
So you want me to go back one more?
No. This one's it, and I need you to go to another slide after that.
Oh, okay. So which slide is that?
It's like the one about Prophet
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to write it down?
Yeah.
All right, let me... Jazakallahu Khair for the question. All right. No, it's good. All right. Let me connect with our sisters, inshallah. Inshallah. Sisters, do you guys have any questions? I think I can hear you guys. Assalamu alaikum, sisters. No questions. Okay, mashallah. Jazakallahu khair. Okay. Any questions on this end? All right, can we get the mic over there?
Can you elaborate on abrogation?
So abrogation is a phenomenon that is found in the Quran, right? And there's, okay. And so we know that ayat have been abrogated. That's not an issue for us. When you say elaborate, do you want me to get into the entire field of nasikh or mansukh and things like that, or? Sorry? Yeah, changing of the qibla is a good one. Ta'wil al-qibla. So initially, the Muslims were told to pray towards Bayt al-Maqdis, and this was fine while they were in Mecca, because they could face the Kaaba and face Bayt al-Maqdis. But when they migrate to Medina, now Kaaba would be behind them if they face Bayt al-Maqdis. So there's a changing of the qibla. So in a sense, that ruling was then abrogated to say that now the qibla is, say, Jazakallahu Khair. You got another one? Yeah, so alcohol, I don't know if we'd call it abrogation, but it was systematically kind of, it was how do I put this? The ruling was such that it was kind of, it was the prohibition came about piecemeal, right? So initially, it was not a direct prohibition, as I'm sure we're all familiar, that it didn't just come down and say, okay, stop drinking, right? So initially they said, okay, well, generally they said the drinking is bad, right? Then you've got concepts, okay, don't come to the salah drunk. And then you come, okay, now it's completely wrong, okay? But this again goes to the kind of the psycho-spiritual emotive state of the companions moving over time. And there's other examples of this too, by the way. So for instance, interest-bearing transactions. Interest actually has the same step-by-step kind of prohibition. So it wasn't initially like, okay, interest is haram right when the Prophet ﷺ comes, but it's not until very late, in fact, and by a few accounts, 9 days before the death of the Prophet ﷺ, when the ayat related to the prohibition of riba come down. The ayat that are very stern, right? فَأَذَنْ بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, and all of those that take notice of war from Allah and His Messenger for those who consume riba. So riba has the same progression as well. So you find that throughout a few different things that had rulings, inshallah. So, Jazakallahu Khair. Okay. Okay. Okay, so the question says, basically you are saying that the isolation of the Quraysh, in particular isolated in a desert, provided them superiority of having an untouched language, unlike the Arabs that lived in Iraq. I'm assuming that means lived in Iraq afterwards. Yeah, maybe you could be saying that, but there's also a few other additional elements to that, right? Because even if when we take that into consideration, to say otherwise, and this is where I'll bring in counter testimonies, to say otherwise leads to absurd implications, like I mentioned. But yeah, if you wanted to really boil it down as one part of the argument, then yeah, you could say that, inshallah. Okay, a couple slides ago. I don't know if this is already answered. Okay, when you say that we have gone to the point of agreement that Allah exists, you are being specific to the creator characteristics of Allah and not beyond that. Am I right? Yes. So when we're talking, when we had, I don't know when this question was asked, but when we're talking about, let's say, some of the arguments about there being a creator, again, we're not saying that we are giving evidence for the entirety of what we understand as the divine, right? Because remember, the idea of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is comes from revelation. We only say about Allah what Allah has told us about Himself. So now we're not saying that our arguments are showing that Allah is Al-Bar, right? Al-Wudud, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Those names and attributes of Allah, we know that by way of revelation. And we only describe Allah as He has described Himself, okay? But yes, there are certain elements, certain attributes that we can know. He is Al-Khaliq. So that is one we can know. So generally, the attributes or the names that are in the realm of what we call Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, His Rububiyyah, that's something you can come to a conclusion with. That's kind of what we're arguing here. But beyond that, Asma wa Sifat, that area that comes by way of revelation. Does that make sense? Inshallah. Okay, any other questions before we break for a bit, inshallah? Okay, you got a question or do you want me to go to another slide? Okay, inshallah. By the way, for whoever registered, I'm going to have them send you guys the slides. So don't worry, don't stress, inshallah. So
this is more related to like the stuff about Inabitability coming to Prophet ﷺ, and like some people say that Prophet ﷺ was like schizophrenic or had like seizures and stuff. So how would you respond to that? Like he was hallucinating and all that stuff. So how would you respond to that?
So what I'll do is I'll refer you guys to a chapter in the Divine Reality. Remember, there's a lot of stuff we don't cover. So there's an entire chapter on the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And that too forms a type of deductive argument, right? That argument is that there's three options when it comes to understanding who the Prophet ﷺ was. That he makes a claim that he's a prophet, so either he's lying, he's telling the truth, or he's deluded. So you're asking about the deluded part. So in the book, it goes over various reasons as to why delusion could not be an option, all right? To give one example, so in other words, he's deluded in thinking that he's a prophet, but in reality, he's not a prophet. That's what we mean by deluded, okay? Now, one example would be, for instance, when his son Ibrahim died, the Prophet's son died, there was an eclipse that happened. And many of the Sahaba, they came out and they said, oh, the son of the Prophet died, and the sun and the moon are even in mourning, right? Like they're even feeling sad. Now, the Prophet when he came out, he said that the sun and the moon, they don't eclipse for the birth or death of any man, but rather they're just a sign, and we should pray. Okay? Now I'm just paraphrasing. So let's take these three options very quickly, all right? So, was he a liar? Was he lying to the claim? If he was, his motivation would have been like, this is a grand opportunity for me to say, yeah, the sun and the moon have eclipsed because my son died because I'm a prophet, all right? If he was deluded, in other words, he thinks he's a prophet, but in reality he's not, he also would have said, oh, this must be a sign, right? Because he's deluded that my son died, right? And therefore the sun and the moon are eclipsed. But that statement that he makes runs completely antagonist to both of those options. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. All right? So you deductively, this is one example. There's many examples throughout the Sira, right? So in other words, you conclude by, deductive necessity that he was telling the truth. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And there's a whole chapter in the Divine Reality for those of you who have the book. For those of you who don't, you can download it for free as a PDF online if you're interested. All right? On the Sapiens Institute website. And I'll bring that up when we go for break. You can download all of our books for free. Obviously, if you want the actual physical copy, I think there's a cost to that. Can we get the mic over here, inshallah? Oh, yeah. Okay, so let me just take his and then we'll come back.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Quran did have some answers to to some of these questions, same questions. أم يقولون شاعر نتربص به ريب المنون بل افتراه مجنون. All of these things are addressed.
Yeah.
But then if we are addressing the atheists of today, we have to address other things. In addition to that, in addition to the standard questions which do repeat and do come.
No.
What is additional are questions like the ones produced by this brother.
Yeah.
The issue of progress. That now we are in the 21st century, we are more progressed people. Who cares about those people in the desert 700 years? They didn't know anything. What language, what? I don't think so. We have progress now. So we have to address what is different in mentality now than then. And then we have to address also issues like, oh, these people of religion, that caused all this destruction. And you know, if God has all this power, then why this evil exists? So, I mean, what are the new challenges that are brought by atheists today that are not clearly addressed at that time?
Okay. So the last one you mentioned about the problem of evil, I think we did a session on that. I don't know if you were here for that, right? And there's more details in the book, right? Obviously, we have a limitation of time, but I think we addressed that pretty thoroughly, right? In a very robust way. And that's why when we are presenting these particular topics, we're referring to a lot of work that's done within academia, right? So even if someone wants to say like, oh, who cares about what those people said, that's not a very rational or let's say modern way of approaching a topic. Like, oh, they were just stupid. I mean, what kind of that's not an erudite or academic way of approaching anything. The stupid people. But okay, but fine, if you think they're stupid, that's your own bias. But why? Like, I'm engaging with you on a level and taking your pre-assumptions, right? One of the main things that I always say is that when you're having a conversation, you always have to find where is the inconsistency in the statement that the person's making to you. And you will definitely find it, 100%, right? So again, oh, who cares about those foolish people back then? Okay, but that's not a very erudite or academic or refined way of analyzing anything. You would never analyze your own history like that, right? Who cares what that foolish man Thomas Jefferson said, right? What does he know about political philosophy? Okay, if I made a statement like that, like, wow, you're such a, like, that's not a good way of analyzing anything, you know? So I think we just have to, you know, I understand what you're saying. There are kind of, you know, we have progress and things like that, but I would hold them to account on even the concept, the philosophical concept of progress. Who says we have progress? What do you mean by progress, right? Is it only material progress, but that's based on your worldview that you can only have material progress within philosophical naturalism? I'm questioning that worldview, right? Because progress for me would mean something that transcends material things which don't even give life meaning. So I'm addressing something that is way deeper than simple material progress, right? So again, what I'm telling a lot of us is when you are in these conversations, don't just accept the paradigm that they're giving you. Question the question, right? Play the role of the skeptic, right? The philosophical skeptic, and say, hold on a second, why is that true? Like, wait, you can't just make an assertion, because what happens is, things in our society, we've just accepted them to be true. All humans are equal. Okay, but wait a minute, how? Under your worldview, how is that true? Like, how do you justify that, right? Okay, we own ourselves. How do you even justify that? Okay, you say self-ownership, like libertarians, for instance. Libertarians are very, you know, within the liberal framework, you've got libertarians, right? They say, you know, no taxes, minimum state, all these things based on the concept of self-ownership. There are certain inconsistencies that arise, right, that run antagonists to the very human project. All right, I'll give you an interesting one. Libertarian says we own ourselves. Taxes are a form of slavery, right? I work for my money. If the government forces me to pay, they're forcing me to work for them. Do you see how that works, right? And that's what taxes are. They're a type of slavery. And we are free. We own ourselves. That's why they say minimum taxes, okay? Now, the problem arises is that if you claim self-ownership, you come into some very sticky situations. And I'll give you one. In Germany, a few years ago, there was a person who put an ad in the paper, right? And this ad in the paper was advertising that I would like to eat somebody. Okay? 200 people replied to the ad. Now, this guy, he interviewed 32 of those people. Okay? This is insane, but it's true, right? You can look it up. After interviewing 32 people, he selects one guy. Okay? Now, the one guy, and all of this he does it on video. He has consent. He says, are you willing to be eaten? You know, and he wasn't even paying them, by the way. They wanted to be eaten for the sheer experience of being eaten. Okay? So now, this happens, the authorities show up, he's got a freezer full of, whatever, John or whatever, whoever was the guy, and so they arrest him. Now the problem arises is at the time, Germany did not have anti-cannibalism laws. So what do you charge the guy with, right? But philosophically, if you own yourself and he was consenting and you're consenting, how does the government come in and say that you're not allowed to do that? Do you get what I'm saying? So you always have to question the question, what are the philosophical pre-assumptions that you're coming to the table with, right? Always do that. And what you're going to find, kufr always contradicts itself. There are always going to be, there's always, whether it's liberalism, feminism, Christianity, atheism, it will always contradict itself, hands down. You just got to dig deep enough and just find it, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and take a break, because I know we've been at it for some time, and then we'll come back and we'll do, and I know the sisters have a few questions, but I'm going to table those until after the break, and we'll start with the questions from the sisters, bi'idhnillah. So let's go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break, but please keep it at 10 minutes because I kind of messed everyone up last time by not having the slides and things like that. So try to make it 10 minutes. Jazakullahu Khair. Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasul Kareem. Let's go and get started, inshallah. If you're outside, go and make your way in. We're limited in our time, inshallah, so I want to make sure we're able to cover our last topic as well as I can, inshallah. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a question from the sisters because they've been waiting patiently. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them. So sisters, if you can hear me, could you please go ahead and ask your question? I think I can hear you guys. Assalamu alaikum, sisters. Yes. Okay. So the comment on intelligent design, there's actually a section in the book that details that, where we talk about how we understand intelligent design, how do we present that as an argument, right? There's a reason I didn't bring it up in the session is because it's actually a very long session. Intelligent design, it's a good argument, but there are a number of contentions, 50 maybe, some crazy number that it just didn't make sense to because then you'd have literally a whole day of just intelligent design. So what I'm going to do is I'll refer you to the book or the online version of this course because we do cover intelligent design in that. Is that fair, inshallah? Sister? Yes? No? Yes, okay. Were there any other questions that you had? Okay, go ahead. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Yes, I can hear you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a good question. So we've spoken about a lot of concepts that are, philosophy laden, and they're heavy on, rational arguments, things like that. Although I will say that we did cover sections on the implications of atheism, which kind of looked at that human beings have certain emotive needs, if that makes sense, right? And we said that under atheism, those emotive needs they're not satisfied, okay? So obviously, these are rational arguments that we presented, at least some of them, but there is, of course, the emotive component of that. Now, we have a course called No Doubt, 10 Strategies to Deal with Your and Other People's Doubts, all right? We did that in the winter intensive here at Dar es-Salaam, Masjid Dar es-Salaam, and we have that course online as well, and an accompanying book to the course. So in that course, we actually cover some of the kind of emotive tools that we can use when we are addressing people that are either having doubts, have left Islam, or are atheists, right? So I'll refer you to that course and book, inshallah. Did that answer your question, sister, or were you asking, did I misunderstand your question? Why? Any other questions, sisters? Is that it? Yes? Okay. All right. Jazakullahu Khairun. The last one. Yeah, so someone asked, what about the option if someone says the Quran could be from a jinn? Can this be refuted that it goes against naturalism. Yeah, I think if we take jinn as an option, then you've kind of negated naturalism, which is the assumption that the person coming to you with is coming to you with. It's kind of like the alien question, although jinns really exist, but it's in a similar light, inshallah. So you're correct in that. Jazakallahu khair. Okay, we are at our final, last section for today, bi'idhnillah, and I would argue that this may be the most important section. And I was just mentioning to one of the brothers that this question about why God, why Allah is worthy of worship, you would think that Muslims know this inside out, right? That they're able to articulate this easily. The communities that I've traveled to across the U.S., when I've asked this question, sometimes the answer is pretty decent. Many times, people aren't really able to articulate why Allah is worthy of worship. Okay? So what I'm going to do, I wanted to kind of post the question to you, right? And see how do we proceed before I kind of start going through the content. So if I were to ask you, why is Allah worthy of worship? How would you respond? Okay, so let's get the mic. Where's our mic person? Do we have the mic anywhere? Oh, it's right here. Okay. Jazakullahu Khair. I think he had his hand up, and then maybe him.
So I'd say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worthy of our worship because of who He is. Okay. And, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He is Al-Kareem, He is the most generous, and everything good that I have in my life, my parents, my health, my education, my friends, everything good I have in my life is only a result of His generosity and the blessings that He has given me. And that I recognize and that I don't is innumerable, And so out of my extreme gratitude and love for what He has bestowed for me, and just a love of who He is as well in terms of His majesty, He is Al-Aziz, He is Al-Jabbar, He is Al-A'la, He's the Most High. Everything about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compels me to hold Him to such a high status that is beyond any level that I could give to a human being. When we see greatness in this world, when we see athletes do incredible things, when we see artists create beautiful portraits and designers and everything, we always have such an astonishment for things in this world, and we can give acknowledgement where it's due. Sure. But when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that level is beyond anything else in the dunya. It's a part of the human. It's a natural human sort of emotion it's part of our intuition to have this sort of sentiment towards the divine because of who He is. So I think that in order to know why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worthy of our worship, we need to know who He is.
Okay, good, mashallah. Did you read the chapter in the book? No, I'm just messing. All right. Did you want to add to that? Okay. The last one, then we'll get into the content.
Not really adding to that, just another point.
Okay.
I was going to bring up what we just discussed like a couple minutes ago, that we proved that the Quran is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the Quran is the book of Allah. We proved that the Quran is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He is worthy of our worship. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worthy of our worship.
Interesting. Okay, good. Okay, let us now enter the topic in earnest, inshallah. So what are we going to cover? All right, we're going to talk first about, before we enter into the topic of why Allah is worthy of worship, we want to know, what do we mean by worship, right? Because worship, when you say that in English, it depends on who you're talking to. It can have various connotations, right? If you go to a Christian and say, worship, what they conceive of when they think of worship might be something that you're not thinking about. You have a different definition in your own mind, right? So we want to understand, according to the Islamic ethos, our Islamic paradigm, what does ibadah mean? What does worship mean? Okay? We'll look at the Quranic strategy. In other words, how does the Quran tie the concept of who Allah is with, as we mentioned, who Allah is with worship? Okay? We'll talk about knowing God, why worship God, and we'll also talk about the fact that every single person whether they're Muslim or not Muslim, worships something. Once we've understood what worship means, we'll see that that concept is applied to something or the other. So, you know, people always talk about freedom, right? The reality is that there's no such, you know, abstract real concept of freedom, because everyone is submitted and surrendered to something, right? So absolute freedom becomes problematic, right, philosophically. And so what we're going to show is that, in fact, true freedom is only when someone worships Allah and submits to Allah. And we're going to get into that, inshallah. All right? And we'll answer a couple of questions. Does God need worship? Why did He create us for worship? And so on and so forth. Okay? Okay. So let's start with what is worship. All right? So now here on the slide I've got, it's to know God, it's to love God, and it's to obey God. All right? It's to single out and direct all acts of worship to God alone. So that includes gratitude, praise, prayer, charity, supplication, so on and so forth. Last night we were having a conversation. I was kind of talking about the same thing. And we said that Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, he has said that when we look at the concept of ibadah, he said it is ghayatul muhabba, in the highest state of love, coupled with the highest state of khudu'a wa dhil, of submission. Okay? So it's love and submission. All right? And he says you have to have both, because I could love my child, but I don't submit to my child. So that is not ibadah. Okay? Conversely, if there was a tyrannical king, his subjects would submit to him, but they don't love him. So that also is not worship. It's only when you couple these things at their apex, at their highest value, that is what we call ibadah. Right? So the word ibadah is related to the word abd, which means slave. Right? So you completely submit yourself, but you don't submit yourself in the sense of some sort of, in terms of, in the English language, when we talk about slave, it has a very negative connotation. But here, when we say we understand this type of servitude comes from a place of love, not a place of just force. Okay? So it's very important to understand our concept of ibadah, worship, has to do with love and submission. Okay? It's very important. All right? In addition to that, it's also knowledge, love, submission, and to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because without knowing Allah, how can you love Allah? How would you say that He should be submitted to? And so on. All of this comes, what else is a part of ibadah, is that it is done out of a sense of humility and sincerity. Okay? So all of that is a part and parcel of worship. And right? It's a very broad concept, but for us to understand it, we can say that it boils down to the highest state of love coupled with the highest state of submission and obedience. Okay? And within that, you have other aspects which make up the concept of ibadah, right? Gratitude, to be grateful, okay? Praise, prayer, charity, supplication. All those are, like some of those are physical manifestations of that worship that we're saying. But from our perspective, worship has to do with the highest state of love coupled with the highest state of submission, all right? And of course, we know this from, from Surah Al-Fatiha, right? إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone do we worship, and you alone do we ask for help. Interestingly enough, worship is not something that is solely in our domain. And what I mean by that is sometimes we think worship is just my own active choice, and I will worship Allah. But when you come back and really ponder upon إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, you alone do we worship, and you alone do we seek help in your worship. Okay? In other words, you're not left to your own devices, right? And we know that right from the ayah. We seek Allah's help in worshiping Allah. Okay? So anyhow, we've understood what worship is. Let's move on. What is the Quranic strategy related to worship? So the Quranic strategy is that it looks at and presents God's creative power, His rububiyyah. Okay, so for those of you who know, who have studied some texts of Aqidah, Rububiyyah includes the idea that Allah is the creator, He is Al-Khaliq, Al-Malik, Al-Mudabbir. Okay, He's the creator, He's the owner, and He's the sustainer. That being established, right, what this whole course was about, the existence of God, is that first part, God's creative power, that Rububiyyah. But the Quran links that to say, if you've accepted that, then there's a link between that and Allah's uluhiyyah, right? In other words, the idea that Allah is worthy of worship, okay? And that is the Quranic strategy. When you read the stories of the prophets, when you read how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is inviting you as to why you should be worshiping Him, it starts from this concept of rububiyyah that's then connected to the concept of uluhiyyah, all right? So, again, the idea that Allah is the creator connected with worship. And you find that over and over again in the Quran, all right? And then the translation I have up there is, and we sent not before you any messenger that we revealed to him that there's no deity except me, so worship me, okay? On a side note here, when we look at the Shahada and we translate it, what's a good translation? Someone help me out. So, La ilaha illallah, how are you going to translate that? What's a good translation? Yeah. Did we already have this discussion? No? Okay, go for it.
So, La ilaha illallah, there's none worthy of love or worship except Allah.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Anyone else? That's not wrong, by the way. I'm just, because translation is always a tricky endeavor.
Submission or obedience.
Other than Allah.
Other than Allah.
Okay, all right. How many people have heard there's no God but God? Have you heard this as a translation? I can't stand that translation, right? It's just because there are so many pre-assumptions that are hidden in the word God, and then you have a self-reference, right? A self-referential statement. There's no God but God. What does that even mean, right? And I see it all the time. And then I started thinking, what if you were to back-translate that, right? Because God generally is, we're talking about rububiyyah. So if you back-translate it, La Rabb illallah, or La Rabb illa Rabb, right? It doesn't even, but La ilaha illallah, an ilah is something that is worshipped, right? That has that maximal state of love coupled with the maximum state of submission, or the highest state of submission, the highest state of love, right? So a translation, there's nothing worthy of that worship, that love and submission, except Allah, okay? So even when it comes to just the core of our, foundations, sometimes translations can set us, apart, right? We kind of start saying, wait a minute, so there's no God but God, so there's literally no God but God, and that becomes almost like some sort of abstract, cerebral, clinical concept of, okay, there's no God but God, and that's it, we'll just leave it alone. And there's no kind of proactive reality for the human being to love and submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when in fact, that reality is built into the Shahada. It's just that because of translation, we kind of miss out on some things. Okay, so let's go on to knowing Allah, because we said knowing Allah is a part of worship as well. So know, fa'lam an la ilaha illallah, right? Know that there's nothing worthy of worship except Allah. And Allah says and commands us for this in the Quran, okay? What exactly are we supposed to know? So there is a oneness in His creative power, as I mentioned, a oneness in His names and attributes. So God's names and attributes are unique, transcendent, and are maximally perfect. They have no deficiency or flaw in the highest degree possible. I've mentioned this sporadically, but just to reiterate it, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, how do we understand His names and attributes? I'm specifically using the term maximally perfect. When people translate the names of Allah in absolute terms, it can lead to philosophical problems. Okay, if you say that Allah is all love and all mercy and all justice, the all is signifying a type of absoluteness that doesn't allow any other attributes to enter into the picture. And so, when we say maximally perfect, what we're saying is, it is the highest degree of perfection such that there's no deficiency in any of the other names and attributes of Allah. Okay? And that's why I'm just trying to be careful with the words we're choosing. Because Christians will come and say, oh, don't you believe that God is all merciful according to your translation of the Quran? So then how can you say He's just? Mercy is it's complete, right? And so on and so forth. So again, and I know you may have studied this in books of Aqidah or whatever, but just to kind of highlight our own usage of the term and how we're trying to understand Allah, right? So Allah's names and attributes are maximally perfect such that there's no deficiency in any other name and attribute. So He's maximally perfect in His love, maximally perfect in His justice, maximally perfect in His mercy, and so on and so forth, such that there could be no one more merciful than Allah, no one more just than Allah, nothing that would be more loving than Allah. All right? I'll give you another kind of issue. We talk about the concept of al-wudud, right? The name of Allah, that Allah is maximally perfect in His love. Christians have defined God as love. Why is the problem of evil much more pronounced and problematic in the Christian or the Christian paradigm? One of the reasons for that has to do with this kind of absolute attribution of love to Allah, and that's it, right? And therefore, they then take the next step and say Allah is unconditionally loving. But if He's unconditionally loving, there's no conditions, then you have a really hard problem of explaining why suffering occurs, right? And I actually mentioned this to someone, I'm like, if He's unconditionally loving, then He loves Muslims too, and so we don't have to become Christian, right? So because He's unconditionally loving, and according to you, being a Muslim is a sin, but He's unconditionally loving, He forgives all sins, khalas, we're good to go, right? Anyhow, it's a separate side point. Okay, and then there's the oneness of His divinity, that Allah alone is worthy of our worship, okay? He's worthy of our obedience, love, prayers, praise, and thanks. Okay, so now we get to the question, why worship God? Now, before I get to this slide, because everyone's going to start reading it, when we talk about why Allah is worthy of worship, right? And our brother was mentioning that, we worship Allah for who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Many times, we misapply or we misunderstand this very concept, which can lead to certain deep, emotive, psychological problems. And what do I mean by that? When we assume that Allah is worthy of worship because of the stuff He gives us, only when we perceive that that stuff isn't there anymore, we have almost this intrinsic idea of, well, therefore I should not worship Allah. Now, I'm not saying we articulate that or that becomes manifest on our tongues, but internally, psycho-spiritually, that becomes a problem because we have misunderstood why Allah is worthy of worship. Now, no doubt, Allah is worthy of worship because of the blessings. That's not a doubt. We should be grateful. But that is part of the reason, not the complete reason, right? And so, therefore, and of course, when you start thinking about the blessings, you would never be able to come to an end, right? If you think about every beat of the heart you have, right? And I think I mentioned this, I don't know, a few days ago when I said, like, nobody thinks of blessings unless you lose a blessing, right? When I think I mentioned this, you're not thinking about your molar teeth right now, okay? But you think about your molar teeth as a blessing when you have a toothache and you got to go to the dentist and he tells you got to get a root canal, right? And then you start thinking, oh, subhanAllah, what a blessing I had for that. But you're not thinking about it now. So the point is that there are so many blessings in tu'uddu ni'mat Allah la tuhsuha. If you try to count the blessings of Allah, you cannot enumerate them, right? Fair enough. Allah we should be grateful for that. He's worthy of worship because of those blessings. But if those blessings were taken away and He didn't give you anything, nothing, would He still be worthy of worship? He would still be worthy of worship because of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. I was having a conversation last night and we were talking about basketball, right? As far as I remember. And what was the name of the player? Zach LaVine. All right, so for those of you who watch basketball, he's on the Bulls. All right, so we talked about Zach LaVine, and I said that when you were to watch Zach LaVine hit a jump shot from, like, let's say mid-court or something crazy like that, and it's all net, okay, you have this intrinsic idea of praising Zach Levine for the shot. You get up, you're like, yes, that was epic, that was amazing, look at all that. I mean, how do you even comprehend that? That was, oh my, wow, right? And the thing is, Zach Levine didn't come up to the stadium and hand you $200. He didn't do anything for you, but you still praised him for an intrinsic quality that Zach Levine had. How much more so when it comes to the one who created Zach Levine in the first place, right? So it's not only about blessings. And the reason I'm stressing this is because when people start to have issues with Islam and Allah related to suffering and trauma and things like that, they have given a meaning to that suffering, and they've attached blessings mean Allah loves me. Blessings mean that Allah is worthy of worship. Blessings mean, when the reality is that is not the meaning, right? Allah is not only worthy of worship because of the blessings. He's worthy of worship because of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, right? So that's kind of a really important part in terms of why worship Allah. So I have up here, God's right to worship is a necessary fact of His existence, all right? So indeed, I am Allah. There's no deity except for me, so worship me and establish my prayer. God has created and also sustains everything, like I mentioned, right? God provides us with innumerable favors. Again, just reiterating that. Now, here's an interesting point. Self-love leads to loving God, all right? So whosoever is besotted by his fleshy appetites, as to lack this love negates his Lord and Creator. He possesses no authentic knowledge of Him. His gaze is limited to his cravings and to things of sense. Imam al-Ghazali mentions this. To highlight this point, the more you know, like there's a tradition, the one who knows himself knows his Lord. Okay? Now that is not a prophetic tradition, just to make sure that's clear. As far as I know, that is not a hadith. It's attributed to either Ali ibn Abi Talib or one of the other Sahaba. But the point is, many people have commented on it, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah has a work on it, Imam al-Nawawi has a work on it, so on and so forth, and commented and given a sharh of this statement, okay? And in that, we see that if in order for a person to really know Allah, they have to know themselves, right? And they have to understand their own, for instance, weakness, so that you can appreciate the perfection of Allah, okay? For instance, the fact that you have imperfect knowledge, that imperfect knowledge leads you to sin. How do I make that connection? Because if you knew the second you're going to do a sin, what the ramifications or effect of that will be, you wouldn't do it. You don't have access to that knowledge. You're imperfect in your knowledge. Therefore, your imperfection in knowledge leads you to sin, okay? Now, if that's the case, it leads you to sin. Your very fact of being human means you are going to sin. Of course, it doesn't end there, because then the requirement is that you turn back to Allah and you ask Allah for His mercy. But the manifestation of that mercy, that name, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, happens because you are an imperfect being and you will sin, and Allah is the one that will forgive you. Do you understand that? How that connects? So knowing yourself, having that self-love, or knowing yourself, leads to knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. His perfection becomes manifest. Your imperfection is then understood. Okay? All right. Why worship Allah? Because He is the most loving. All right? These are some of the names and attributes. We could do a whole talk on this. I'll mention just one because we have to conclude in a few minutes. Take the name, for instance, Ash-Shakur. Okay? Ash-Shakur comes from the term shukr. What does shukr mean? Gratitude, right? And if you speak Urdu or Arabic, or I don't know if it's true in Bangla, but is it true in Bangla? Does anyone speak Bangla? Yes? Same thing? Shukr, shukriya, something like that? Okay. All right. Shukr, if you really think about it, this concept of gratitude, it is what we call a fitri concept. It is not necessarily a rational concept. I mentioned this earlier. But if I'm going to do a little bit of a linguistic foray, if you'll allow me, all right? The term shukr, when we look at the etymology of the word, you can trace it back to certain concepts or certain statements. So for instance, an animal may be called dabbatun shakur, right? The very same term, shakur, the name of Allah. Why? This type of animal this dabba is shakur, that is considered, that is very fat, okay? It's very meaty. It's got a lot of, it's got a lot of meat on it. And why it's called that is because when it eats a little bit of food, it gets fat very quickly. As opposed to an animal that you feed and you feed and you feed and it stays emaciated, okay? The animal that you give a little bit of food and it becomes very fat, that is dabbatun shakur, okay? That is an animal, okay, but why? Because with that little bit that you've given it, the manifestation is way more, okay? When it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the little paltry deeds that you do, right, in comparison to everything else, all of the sins, Allah gives all of that and elevates that way more than that simple deed that you did. He is ash-shakur because of that. He's appreciative from that perspective, okay? All right, so that's one name of Allah. That is ash-shakur. If you start to look at the names of Allah from this perspective and started to pile them up, you couldn't help but understand that Allah is worthy of our worship, okay? And that's true for when you think about the word, the name of Allah, al-wudud. You think about the name of Allah, al-bar, the source of all goodness, right? And so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to skip some of these. Let me come to this point because I have to conclude as we have people coming in for Dhuhr, inshallah. Man, human beings, cannot not worship based on our definition. Every single human being worships, as we've defined worship, something. So either you will submit to and love something the most and submit to something the most, either that will be Allah, or that will be society, or that will be the economy, or that will be your parents, or that will be yourself. Have you not seen the one, have you not seen the one who has taken his God, his ilah, his desires as his God? Right? You could submit to and love yourself the most, like I'm all that, I'm only going to do what I want to do, it's my choice. But then you go back. Are you worthy of worship? Your limitation of knowledge, of power, you yourself can't justify that. So every human worships. The question then arises, who is worthy of that worship, right? So every single human being worships, all right? Now the problem with worshiping other things is that you have competing masters. Society tells you something, you want to do something, the economy tells you, and so what happens is it leads to a type of dissonance, spiritual dissonance. You're split between all of these different, quote-unquote, masters. How do you free yourself from that? What is true freedom? By submitting and loving one absolute master. Because then that dissonance that you're in, what do I submit to? And all these various masters, that now becomes one. And that tawheed then becomes manifest by way of that submission. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, bi'idhnillah, and because we have to conclude. What time does the Dhuhr start? 1:30? Okay, so we have to basically stop here. I know we have questions. Unfortunately, I have to leave to the airport, right, because I have a flight to catch. I did put the information on the slides. I will have the administration send out the information along with the slides to everyone that registered for the course, inshallah. So you have my word on that. That being said, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you, the people that attended all 3 days. May Allah reward you for your patience, and may Allah bless you and bless your families. May He give you the best of this life and the best of the afterlife. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from you all of your efforts that you have done for His deen. And also, just to mention something, this is a lot of content, and I know for a fact I made a number of mistakes. So please forgive me for those mistakes. Those mistakes are all mine. Anything of goodness, it is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I ask you to just keep me in your du'as and my family and so on and so forth. But may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. And it was a great pleasure to be here and visit your community. I always love coming here. The last time I came in the winter intensive was wonderful. And similarly, all my experiences with all of you has just been enormously, I'm enormously grateful to all of you to have interacted with me. And I really do appreciate that. Jazakumullahu khair. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Please parents are for all gaps in between, please, not for cell phones. Barakallahu feekum. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. Allahu Akbar. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, our program has now officially come to a conclusion, the Divine Reality Workshop. May Allah Azza wa Jal reward and bless all those who participated, those who invited others, those who helped out in the arrangements, and those who marketed the program, those who prepared the slides and the volunteers in the registration, those who were taking care of the book sales, as well as all the canteen. Yesterday was a very hot day, and the brothers sacrificed a lot, sisters and brothers sacrificed a lot in having arrangements made for our guest. So I want to have all of you remembered and recognized for your sacrifices, the brothers and sisters all who came from, mashallah, so nice to see people came from out of state to attend this program, booked a hotel, and came with their families to benefit. So this was a blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you were chosen to attend. Thousands were invited, but you were the chosen ones who were allowed to come. So congratulations to all the attendees and the students who benefited from Ustad Fahad Tasleem. And I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to bless him and his family immensely for his sacrifice for the deen. May He make him and his efforts a means of bringing people back towards Islam and a means of removing doubts from the minds of the people who are going through those type of difficulties. The effort doesn't end over here. The effort doesn't end over here. The book Divine Reality is outside, and what Ustad Fahad said, listen, I can't be speaking every day all across the country like a headless chicken, right? What we need is people to master these things that he shared with us and to become du'at yourself. That's what it is. So take from here not just the lessons that you learn from here, but learn how to express this. So Sapiens Institute is his organization. And inshallah, I've invited him to come visit us again. But what he's asking and what makes logical sense is that, since we've been talking a lot about logical sense is that we have to learn how to do it ourselves. So those of you who felt that this presentation spoke to you and you were able to connect well, I want you to understand that you need to take it to the next level. There's so many thousands of people who are very confused, and you may be the answer to their confusion. Not everyone can do this. And not everyone will even be confused in this manner, nor will they be unconfused in this manner. Right? It's a very specific type of people who go through what we've been discussing for the past few days. So that's why those of us who I saw, mashallah, some amazing, engaging youth who kept on asking questions, who really followed along. I want you to please understand that if you followed along and you enjoyed this program and you benefited, you can't stop there. You have to become a leader as well. You have to become a da'i and connect yourself with Ustad Fahad. He's still here. He's going to be leaving to the airport shortly. Get his information if you haven't already done so. Connect with him to see how you can, inshallah, join his team. And the team of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in reality, Hezbollah, the team of Allah Azza wa Jal, to help those who are suffering throughout the globe. So that's one thing. And then the recordings are available. You can get the professional video recordings of the entire series from the Sapiens website. Is that right? Okay, and then for those who actually wanted to listen to our own, what will happen over here, so the links have already been shared to those who've registered for the program. We usually have this topic in the winter intensive. So we will have, once again, on your way out, if you're coming from out of town, there's a big board at the archway entrance that's got all our dates of our next programs. So the CETA conference, the winter retreat, next year's retreat, all are mentioned there. Take a picture of that. So I'm letting you know from right now, Christmas weekend, I expect you all, inshallah, to be back here. Christmas weekend is a weekend, the 4 days that we usually cover academic topics of postmodern issues every year. Different speakers, different presentations, but it's very nice. So plan your week holidays to come here December 25th weekend, inshallah, for 4 days. It will be probably 25th to 28th. So make sure you put that in your schedule. So that's with this. Weekly programs every Tuesday. We have tafsir. Monday nights, inshallah, in the next few weeks, we'll be starting our dars of Sahih al-Bukhari. Saturday mornings, we have our dars on tazkiyah. That is a way to connect yourself. I must add, as he must have said, that this logical... Yusuf, just take him, please. Yusuf, take you. The logical discussions that we've had so far are great, but this is not what's going to save a person. Right? This is one step. Spirituality is very, very important. And so I want you to understand, staying connected and praying salah with jama'ah in an environment like this is very powerful in making your spirituality strong. This is great what we heard, but that doesn't turn on the light of nur in our heart. We need an environment like this, of praying salah with jama'ah, doing dhikr, attending programs on a repeated basis that will, inshallah, tabarak wa ta'ala, put the spirituality in our heart. So I encourage everyone to make a point here to pray salah with jama'ah in your local masjid at least once or twice a day. Say inshallah. Once or twice a day in your local masjid. And try to listen to the Tuesday night program, Monday night program, and Saturday morning. All of this is live streamed from our YouTube channel, so you can listen online, inshallah, tabarak wa ta'ala. Okay, for today, we have two more programs that I'm actually speaking in. One is right now, we have a first Sunday of every month, we have a sisters program. So this is for those of you, if your wives are in the area, daughters are in the area, let them know the first Sunday of every month at Darus Salam in the women's prayer hall, we have a women's program. They have their own dhikr and things of that sort, and then myself or Mufti Minhaj address them as well. So that's taking place right now. Shortly we'll start. Second is that tomorrow is Ashura, so please, I remind you to fast. And if you haven't already fasted today, then fast with that on Tuesday as well. We should be fasting the 9th and the 10th, or the 10th and the 11th. As we know, Rasulullah said, 1 year's fast, that 1 day's fast, I have hope from Allah that Allah will make it a means of forgiving our entire past year's sins. After Asr, I will be speaking about Ashura. So if you're local, please come by here for Asr. And then we'll do some dhikr after that. And then we'll have dua, individual time for dua. And we'll have light iftar after Salat al-Maghrib for everyone. And that's for today and for tomorrow. And don't forget to spend some of your money that Allah has given you on your family, especially on tomorrow. Tomorrow starts after Maghrib. So use that opportunity to spend in the path of Allah on your family, and this will become a means of barakah, inshallah. Last but not least, I want all of you to make dua. I want you to join me in dua right now for this event, the acceptance of it. But also, I got the very sad news right before I came here of a classmate of mine who studied with me in South Africa, who was from Malawi, and who was a wali of Allah. He was a friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a very righteous, pious person. To tell you into context, I'll speak about him a little bit later, inshallah, tonight or tomorrow. But one thing I wanted to say is that his sajda, his prostration would be regularly 45 minutes long. One sajda. To the extent I would be thinking as a madrasa student that he had fallen asleep. And I'd go tap him. And he would yarfa'u sawtahu bil buka. He would just simply raise his voice to allow me to hear his crying. Every single night when I finish up my studies, I go to the masjid and he'd be in a corner, in that left side corner of the masjid in South Africa. And 45 minutes, 50 minutes would be one sajda of his. He had a very rough life, wasn't very religious at all. He wasn't religious at all before coming to madrasa. Events happened in his life, he changed. When he came to madrasa, he wanted to become a new person, and he wanted to value every single second to make up for the life that was spent in the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he didn't sit there and joke too often. He was very serious. While doing the 7-year alim program, without telling anyone, he memorized the entire Quran on his own, because he wouldn't waste a second. And so today, subhanAllah, he was driving back from a lake, I think so. Him and his one or two daughters, I don't have the full details yet, had a car accident and they passed away. He lost his father in Eid, and now him and his daughter, or two daughters, have passed away. So I have full expectation from Allah that he's going to a very beautiful place. He was much, much more righteous and pious than the rest of us. He was a chosen man. But what makes me sad is that pious people like this, young and old, are leaving us. There are very few in the first place to begin. And then those who are also leaving us. So it's time for us to truly become something. We don't know when our turn is going to be. So if Allah brought you here today for this workshop and this past weekend, let's make it a wake-up call. And say, Allah, I don't know how many years I got left, how many months I got left, how many days I have left. Any day could be my last. So let's make up with Allah Azza wa Jal and utilize today's fast, tomorrow, or the day after's fast. Lots of tawbah, lots of istighfar. Asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for hidayah for ourselves, or for humanity, for children, and forgiveness for all those who passed away. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma anta salam wa anka salam wa tabarak ya dhal jalali wal ikram. Allahumma laka alhamdu kullu wa laka shukru kullu. Allahumma la nuhsi thana'an alayka anta kama athnayta ala nafsik. اللهم اغفر لحينا وميتنا وشاهدنا وغائبنا وصغيرنا وكبيرنا وذكرنا وانثانا اللهم من حييت منا فاحيا على الاسلام ومن توفيت منا فتوفاه على الايمان اللهم اغفر له وارحمه واعف عنه وادخله الجنه اللهم نقي من الذنوب كما ينقى الثوب الابيض من الدنس اللهم اجعل قبره روضه من رياض الجنه ولا تجعل حفره من حفر النار اللهم لا تحرمنا اجره ولا تفتنا بعده وابدله دارا خيرا من داره واهلا خيرا من اهله اللهم اجعله لنا اجرا وذخرا اللهم اجعلها لنا اجرا وذخرا واجعلها لنا شافعا ومشفعا. Oh Allah, we ask you to accept this workshop. Oh Allah, the purpose of this workshop was to bring people back towards the deen. Ya Allah, to remove doubts against you and your Prophet, against Quran that are plaguing the minds and the hearts of people. Oh Allah, this was a small, humble effort, but the goal was to spread the nur of Islam throughout the globe. Oh Allah, although we are weak human beings and our efforts are obviously filled with flaws, but you are the ultimate, most powerful being. Oh Allah, you are the ultimate guide. Oh Allah, we ask you to allow the winds of hidayah from here to spread throughout the globe. Oh Allah, all those who are suffering from doubt, all those who are suffering from confusion, all those who have fallen into sin and have become hopeless, from your mercy, Ya Allah, guide them and guide us, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, allow Darus Salam staff and Darus Salam's teachers and students and volunteers and guests who come and speak here. Oh Allah, and our well-wishers, Ya Allah, and our supporters to all become a means of guidance for themselves and millions of people throughout the globe. Oh Allah, we ask you to grant us the ability to be protected from the fitna of Dajjal and from the fitna that comes before his arrival. Oh Allah, allow us to recognize right from wrong. Allow us to follow the right and allow us to stay away from the wrong. Oh Allah, please allow us to have the proper parenting skills to be able to raise our children in this day and age. Ya Allah, we ask you to grant muhabba and love for you, for your Prophet, and for the Quran and for the deen, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, remove from our heart the love of every single thing that you do not want us to love. Oh Allah, and fill in our heart the love of everything that you want us to love. Oh Allah, make us your true, humble sovereigns, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, rid us of the worship of our ego, Ya Allah. Rid us of our worshipping of our nafs and our base desires, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, allow all those who have attended these past 3 days to continue their journey of seeking ilm, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, whether it's at Darus Salam through the 1-year program, the weekend Tafheem program, or the integrated high school program, or any other part of the country, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, make it easy for every single one of us to become and remain students of knowledge, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, all those who made efforts behind the scenes, oh Allah, to make this program happen, we ask you to grant all of them. And those who are at the front, grant them ikhlas and sincerity as well, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, we ask you to grant maghfirah and Jannat al-Firdaus to Maulana Uthman Ibrahim. Oh Allah, who spent his life in poverty and who remained dedicated while teaching blind people in a madrasa in Malawi, in one of the poorest countries of the world. Oh Allah, he spent his life in difficulty. Oh Allah, we ask you to allow him never to see difficulty now that his soul has reached you, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, allow sabr jameel to his wife and his remaining children, Ya Allah, and make his daughters who passed away, Ya Allah, a beautiful gift for their mother, Ya Allah, and all those who they have left behind, Ya Allah. Oh Allah, all those who left us from this ummah, we ask you to grant them forgiveness. Oh Allah, those who are still around, oh Allah, we ask you to grant us a life filled with iman and give us death with iman and raise us with iman on the day of judgment. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Ameen wa jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Those brothers and sisters who want to take a tour, we have students here ready to take you for a tour, inshallah, of the seminary, and sisters also, there are sisters available to give you a tour. Jazakumullahu khairan.